Welcome back, everyone. This is your host, the DN WhatIf 2.0, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Nedzu found a hero in a green blur? A special shout out to the original creator, TechnicallyAPerson. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Nedzu was a reconnaissance hero. As such, it was rare to find him involved in a villain attack, well, in person, that is. Normally heroes like him spent their days behind a computer or on the phone. The majority of his contributions to villain takedowns happened behind the scenes, creating strategies away from prying eyes. After being observed in a lab for so long, it felt like the only way he could really help. The few media appearances he had were already enough to make him a nervous, anxious mess. Not that he would ever allow anyone to notice, of course. Unfortunately, that meant that when an attack happened in broad daylight, he was too out of practice to do much about it. Of course, even if he had been training, it would have been difficult. Slime surrounded him on all sides, the viscous liquid forcing itself down his throat as his limbs thrashed around violently. Nearby he could spot no less than 3 pro heroes, yet all they did was stand there. A crowd had begun to form, if the noise was any indication, but still no help. He was running out of breath, he knew it, and his panicked eyes roved over the crowd. Sunken blue eyes stood out, regretful and morose, and suddenly eyes were all he could see. Dozens of people, all of them staring, just watching. More colors flashed by after the blue, hateful red, dull yellow, full white, landing on a vibrant green. His eyes sunk closed, his brain desperately trying to regain control of his body. He tried to relax, to hold out just a little while longer, and his tail thrashed into the air to try and swat at the perpetrator, but he knew it was no use. At that point, with not a single competent hero willing to step in, he knew he was done for. But then he felt something graze his face. On instinct he recoiled, remembering the injury that had resulted in his scar, but then his whiskers twitched and he felt fresh air. Surging forward with all his strength, he gasped as the shock of the cool air met his fur, and he barely reacted when a hand closed around his arm to pull him out just a bit more. Before he'd even gotten a chance to recover, he felt another, larger hand close over the hand that had grabbed him, and a gust of wind stronger than any natural force tore through the street. He was left dangling from All Might's grasp. He was whisked away by the paramedics before he could get a word in, and as soon as he was cleared of the disgusting sludge he returned to the scene. All Might stood to one side, dealing with the press, so he quickly avoided the entire area. Looking around, he finally spotted what, or rather, he'd been looking for, though it appeared there'd been some sort of misunderstanding. The 3 heroes that had neglected to do their jobs now seemed to be scolding his savior. "Hello," he started pleasantly. "What seems to be the problem here?" His presence seemed to startle everyone involved. A hero he recognized as Death Arms was the first to recover. "That's it. Are you feeling all right?" "Yes, I'm feeling fine. And all thanks to this young man, it seems." The young man in question seemed more nervous now than he had when he was being scolded, which didn't seem right. Worse was how he hunched into himself, becoming smaller and lowering his presence in seconds. It looked practiced. Death Arms narrowed his eyes. "I'm sorry to say it, sir, but you're wrong." This delinquent dash, Nedzu narrowed his own eyes at this word, ran in with no consideration for his own safety or the safety of others. Despite the presence of 4 pro heroes at the scene, he thought his help was needed or even wanted. He rushed in carelessly, and only increased the number of people All Might had to rescue. "That's not the way I see it," he said simply. He watched the boy's eyes widen in surprise. "You see, from where I was, which we can both agree gave a pretty central view of the whole event, it seemed like I was surrounded by supposed pro heroes who were so bad at their jobs they had to wait for a child to do it for them. Tell me, for what reason were none of you even attempting a rescue? Because had I been under the sludge for even 10 seconds longer, I am quite certain I would be dead." The boy gasped, but Nedzu's attention was on the 3 heroes in front of him. For actually, now he noticed a lady a short ways away. He gave them all a withering glare, daring them to justify their actions. Unsurprisingly, Death Arms was first. Well, I was doing crowd control. Everyone was acting crazy and trying to get a better look, especially when word got out that it was you. I was protecting the civilians and stopping them from interfering. Nedzu focused his glare on him. Well, you surely did a good job of that. He winced internally when he saw the green-haired boy flinch at that, but he kept staring at the remaining heroes. If any of them had been his students, he would have given them an even more intense verbal lashing, but he supposed he couldn't expect so much from other hero schools. Kamui Woods was next. I was evacuating other civilians, sir, along with Backdraft. The sludge villain caused significant structural damage, and some civilians were in need of medical attention. I'm well suited for evacuation, so I focused on that. Backdraft gave emergency medical treatment. We expected Death Arms to handle the villain, but it seems his priorities shifted. Nedzu hid his amusement at how blatantly he'd thrown his fellow hero under the bus, but it was difficult not to crack a small smile at the affronted noises Death Arms was now making. While it is commendable what you managed to do, you were also the best suited for fishing me out of there. Backdraft, you could have attempted to water down the villain. He turned to the last of the four. And what about you, young lady? The hero in question stiffened, shifting uncomfortably. I couldn't fit into the street. It had started off at a normal volume, but quickly descended into little more than a mutter. Nedzu sighed. He'd expected more of the next generation of heroes. And what, pray tell, were you all waiting for? I almost died. Most civilians would not have lasted as long, and many would have caused more problems in their panic. Did you even try to strategize? We were waiting for someone with a suitable quirk. None of us were really suited for the situation, and we especially didn't have a way of apprehending the villain. So we stalled, and eventually All Might came, so it worked out. We don't deserve to get scolded for doing the right thing. Nedzu's eye twitched. Is that what you call almost allowing someone to die on your watch? Contrary to popular opinion, quirks aren't everything. I'm disappointed that you of all people seem to not understand that. He sighed, turning to the child. Have you gone to the paramedics? He shifted under Nedzu's gaze. No, Nedzu, sir. But I'm fine. I coughed out all the sludge a while ago, and just now I didn't even get hurt. What do you mean you coughed out the sludge? Did the villain try to attack you when you jumped in to save me? Nedzu was surprised, and even more horrified by the actions of these heroes. How could they neglect to make sure he was all right? But looking closer, it seemed that they were as surprised by this as he was. Hopefully that meant it hadn't been bad. The villain attacked me first, about a half hour ago. All Might rescued me, but then I did something stupid and freed him and caused all this trouble, and it's all my fault and dashed. The rest of what the boy said became nearly unintelligible. Mumbling, but Nedzu was too shocked to pay much attention. He interrupted his ramblings. Did All Might make sure you were okay? Call the paramedics? Anything? Externally he appeared to be calm, but internally was anything but. Yagi had better hope that the answer given was the correct one. Well, no, but he didn't really have the time. He did tell me how to get down, though, and my lungs feel fine now, and he even signed my notebook. So it's all right, really. Get down from where? Well, we ended up on the rooftop of an office building. It was easy to get someone to come up and let me down. I'm going to kill that blonde buffoon. Just as he was about to insist that he go get checked by the paramedics, he rushed away. Anyway, I have to get home or my mom'll worry. It was nice to meet you, Nedzu sir. In seconds he was gone, blended in with the crowd. Coincidentally, All Might had also disappeared. That luck won't last you, Yagi. Your days are numbered. He turned back to the heroes. Yours as well. He enjoyed watching them shiver. Suddenly MT Lady let out a panicked shout. Wait, we let him get away. Wasn't what he did technically vigilantism? Before Nedzu could defend him, Death Arms decided to dig his grave a tad bit deeper. Didn't you see his shoes? He's quirkless. He spit the word out like it was poison. For vigilantism you need to use a quirk. The disgust and contempt in his voice reminded Nedzu of the way people spoke of him, on occasion. He would not stand for it. Good to know that a middle schooler could do without a quirk what you could not do with one. Perhaps you do not deserve your license, if you're less competent than someone you seem to have such hate for. He sputtered out excuses, but Nedzu resolutely ignored them. Addressing all of them, he gave them a quick warning and the knowledge that they'd be placed on probation. He began to walk away, content to let the day's events slip from his mind until he felt prepared to fill out the paperwork and perhaps try to find the child who saved him, when he spotted a charred and soaked notebook on the floor. It looked like it had maybe been well cared for at some point, but it was far from it now. Thankfully, the pages had dried enough to look through it carefully, and he happened to open it onto a page covered in bold marker. All Might's signature, to be exact. Curiously, it looked to have been written after the rest of the damage had been done. Remembering how the boy had mentioned an All Might signature, he held onto it, hoping to return it to him personally. It wasn't until he read the titled Hero Analysis for the Future that he felt compelled to look into it further. He was shocked to find page after page of in-depth analysis of many popular heroes. Some of the writing was too messy to understand, and a lot of the ink had begun to bleed because of water damage, but whatever was left would give most professionals a run for their money. There were even some applications for his staff's quirks that he himself hadn't thought of, though to be fair he wasn't focused on that type of work. Nedzu could barely contain his excitement at the mere thought of molding such a brilliant young mind. With that, he began to make his way through the crowd and towards the general direction he'd seen him go. It was child's play to connect to a few public security cameras, and now with a location in mind he sped up. Finally reaching him, he hid behind a corner as a very loud blonde teen stormed away. Emerging from his hiding place, he made his presence known with a cough. The height he achieved with the shock jump was truly impressive. Nedzu, I'm sorry, did you need something from me? His eyes were blown wide and it seemed he was nervous. Quite the opposite, actually. I have something of yours. He held out the notebook for him to take, which he did quickly. He cradled it to his chest, and Nedzu spied some tears beading in the corners of his eyes. Thank you. I hadn't even realized I'd lost it. He bowed. I'm honored you came to give it to me personally. He turned to leave. I also wanted to thank you. The child started. It was very heroic to jump in there. Are you planning on being a hero? He watched as the kid tensed. His response was hesitant. I was. I'm not anymore, I don't think. That was alarming. May I ask why? I'm quirkless, sir. He looked a little surprised at his own outburst. Everyone says I can't be a hero. Even All Might. I need to be realistic. Nedzu mentally added another tally to the list of things Yagi had to answer for. He watched as the kid locked his gaze downwards, as if expecting something negative. What's your name? Oh, Midoriya. Midoriya Izuku. Well, Midoriya, I happen to have a little look in your notebook. What I found surprised me. He ignored the sudden flurry of apologies for now. The analysis in here is incredible. If it were refined, I'm sure many pros would be willing to pay quite high sums for it. Not to mention that they could all be used to take them down fairly easy. Your mind is quite the weapon. At this point Midoriya was looking at him, transfixed. He had his attention. Midoriya, my quirk only gives me enhanced mental capacities. Yet I'm still a hero, correct? He nodded. I can tell you with full confidence that if you work for it, this analysis could be used to further hero society immensely. Midoriya Izuku, he said, you can be a hero. He was not in any way prepared for the deluge of tears that followed. Once Midoriya calmed down, Nedzu asked for his contact. The boy was puzzled for a moment, but when Nedzu explained he'd like to help him train his analysis, he burst into tears once more. Human emotions confused Nedzu on the best of days, but he was fairly sure this wasn't normal. Eventually he actually looked at the time, and politely excused himself. Upon realizing how late it was, Midoriya scrambled to apologize and also race home. Apparently his mother was prone to worrying. Nedzu watched him go, his tail happily swishing side to side, before finally letting his artificial smile drop as he turned to All Might. Get out here. I know where you are, you blonde idiot. His voice was a little sharper than usual, but he felt it was justified. His eyes narrowed as the skeletal form of Yagi Tashinori stepped out from around a corner. He looked vaguely terrified, which was strange considering he shouldn't know exactly what Nedzu was angry about quite yet. He started speaking, but his voice cracked and he tried again. And it's good to see you. What are you doing here, exactly? Inwardly Nedzu chuckled. Literally every part of his body was portraying fear. It would have been almost funny, if not for the sudden realization of what it meant. Nedzu had known about One for All for a long time, having figured it out for himself a bit after All Might's crippling fight. He had also been kind enough to allow Yagi to take on a teaching position at UA, provided he got at least some semblance of teaching education, to help him find a successor. He also knew that he only showed fear when he was risking losing a friendship, and as far as Yagi knew, the only thing that consistently bothered Nedzu was someone trying to take what was his. No, absolutely not. His words were clipped, clear. He made his glare a bit more obvious. Unfortunately, it appeared he hadn't yet realized what had happened. He scratched his head, taking a surprised step back. What? Nedzu, I don't know what you're objecting to, exactly dash. I'm objecting to you poaching my apprentice. He needs someone to guide his mind, not some big blonde dumbass forcing him to do push-ups. I got to him first, and I'm keeping him. I haven't had a proper mind to mold before, and I'm sure it will be a very constructive experience. For both of us. Yagi stood there, mouth gaping like a fish. It was rare for Nedzu to swear. He began to protest. But he's perfect. He has a heroic spirit, and I really need to find a successor dash. And you will get your chance, he interrupted him. That is why you're planning on coming to UA, after all. What you want is another meathead to fit into your own mold, and Midoriya is too valuable an asset to allow you to do that, he said, dripping with disappointment. I suggest you do some serious thinking about your successor and how much autonomy you really want to give them. Meanwhile, Nedzu's smile sharpened, but it held no warmth. We have much to talk about, Yagi. The man in question shivered. Dash asterisk asterisk dash asterisk asterisk dash asterisk. You absolute Swiss cheese-headed, muscle-obsessed, insensitive buffoon. They both stood for a while, the only sound coming from Nedzu's heavy breathing after his rant. Yagi held a handkerchief covered in blood, his expression sheepish and cowed. He was hunched over slightly, eyes glued to the ground. He wouldn't argue. It hadn't ended well the last few times. Finally, Nedzu caught his breath. He turned back to the thin man, ready to wrap up his scolding. His voice softer now, he began. Yagi, I understand why you did what you did. Most of the time I would have said the same thing. But there are a few things you failed to take into consideration. He held up his paw, listing things off. Firstly, he'd just gone through a very traumatic experience. Second, he was very clear about you being his idol. Third, you left him alone on a rooftop. And lastly, you failed to keep in mind that quirkless suicide rates are at an all-time high. At this, Yagi's head snapped up. They're what? He breathed. Nedzu only nodded sadly. It's good to give him other things to focus on, but not immediately after crushing his first dream. You would say something along the lines of, there's nothing stopping you from trying, but remember that you can help people significantly in many other ways. Or, working behind the scenes to help heroes is even more important, sometimes. Keep your options open? Nedzu sighed. But that wasn't the main problem. Not ensuring he got medical attention, allowing the villain to escape without notifying more heroes, and revealing your life and career-threatening injury to a middle schooler you met 10 minutes ago are all arguably worse. You need to be more careful, Yagi. The man sighed, picking himself up. I know. It has become painfully obvious. He turned to face Nedzu fully and bowed. Thank you, Nedzu. And I'm sorry for trying to poach your student. He cracked a small smile, much more genuine than the one he wore as All Might. Make sure to prepare him well. I look forward to having him in my class someday. He buffed up, enough time having passed for him to recover some strength, and leapt away. Watching him leap away, Nedzu shook his head. Still, he couldn't help the fondness that welled up for the man. Compared to the people he was used to dealing with, both in the HPSC and his staff, his incredibly genuine nature was a breath of fresh air. Dash asterisk asterisk dash asterisk asterisk. His small body not capable of moving around as effortlessly as All Might, Nedzu called for a car. It arrived in minutes, and soon he was sitting back in his office at UA. He had other duties to get to, but first, he had a couple of things to look into. If Midoriya was that proficient in what he referred to as just a hobby among his high-speed nervous ramblings, then his grades must be absolutely stellar. Quickly figuring out what school he went to based on what he remembered of the uniform he'd seen, he wasted little time hacking into Aldra's file system. Sure, he could just ask for the relevant file, but he enjoyed the small challenge and very much did not enjoy the prospect of human interaction. He shivered slightly in his seat. Pulling up the top-scoring students, he waited for a familiar head of green hair to show up at the very top. He was surprised, instead, to find an angry-looking blonde by the name of Bakugu Katsuki. He looked familiar, and it took Nedzu a few seconds to place him as the boy that had been yelling at Midoriya before Nedzu arrived. Assuming it to be a one-off thing, he was increasingly surprised to scroll down and find other names. It took him nearly 3 minutes of quick scrolling to land on his future student. That couldn't be right. That was the only thought that occupied Nedzu's brain at the moment. This was a puzzle. Surely, Midoriya was barely in the top half of the entire school, his grades just enough to not get thrown out immediately by any good high school. Fortunately, Nedzu loved puzzles. The first thing he noticed was how closely the grades toed the line of failure, but never slipped. Throughout the entire 2.5 years he'd been there, they hadn't dipped below the line once. A bit more hacking revealed scores from individual periods of time, and they revealed even more information. Occasionally, due to a project or classwork, a score would be given that would surely cause his overall grades to take a large hit. But immediately following these instances, a large spike in grades always followed. It only ever lasted enough to get back on track, but it was intriguing to say the least. The next thing he looked into were the personal files on each student. His eyes widened in shock at the sheer amount of marks on his record. In most cases, the presence of these marks would have immediately warranted the addition of a black one, effectively barring him from any good high school in the country. But as it stood, a black mark could only be added with good reason, and looking at the annotations for each infraction made it clear that any reason at all was something they severely lacked. Everything on the list was harmless. It ranged from muttering in class to arriving 2 minutes late, none of which deserved the punishments that were doled out. 5 days detention, 20-page essays, 3-point grade reduction, the list went on, with fairly large infractions given for every small error. It was no wonder the child had possible anxiety, or even worse. This school didn't deserve the title. Luckily, Nedzu also loved taking down corrupt institutions. He held off for now, however. It could possibly be used as a learning experience, and Nedzu was not one to waste those. His tail swished wildly at the mere thought of it, and he brewed himself some tea to calm down. First, though, he needed to assess his student's level. Picking up his phone, he sent a message, chuckling slightly at the mental image of Midoriya's reaction to having a pro message him. He had a lot to do, and it was time to get started. Midoriya Izuku was freaking out. Not that he wasn't before. He'd met both All Might and Nedzu. And all in a single day. But now, with a cryptic message innocently displayed on his phone screen, from none other than the principal of UA himself, it was all he could do to stop himself from screaming. After returning home to a delicious dinner and assuring his mom that yes, he was fine, stop worrying, he got to work drying out his notebook. It was still slightly damp, and the ink from the sections he actually used pen in had already bled. This did little to discourage him, however, and he set to work meticulously separating each and every page to make sure they were still legible. Thanks to most of it being in pencil, it was easy to pick up on what he was trying to say in the parts it had become illegible, and he could always redo the sketches when he had the time. He didn't even notice the time until he finished, sometime after 10 o'clock. He stood up, ready to go to bed, but winced when the movement of his arm caused the fabric of his shirt to rub against his most recent burn. Dutifully, he headed to his closet, digging out the first aid kit he kept in there. Luckily, he was fairly well stocked on burn cream, and he had it treated and wrapped in no time. He regretted this when he realized he had yet to shower. Quickly undoing his bandages, he headed to the bathroom to wash the residual slime on him. The hot water on his burn was unpleasant, but not unbearable, and soon he felt much more refreshed. On his way back he dumped his clothes in the washer for a quick cycle, silently marveling at the lack of damage to his uniform. It had been a while ago, when Izuku was still friends with Kaken, that he figured out about the dual part to his friend's quirk. The mutation had always been there, it was the only explanation, since sweat glands couldn't just spontaneously gain the ability to secrete nitroglycerin. The only thing that had come in at the age of 4 was his ability to ignite it, using small sparks he could produce just above his palms. Considering how Uncle Masaru's quirk let him start small fires in the palm of his hand, this mutation made sense, if a little bit of a stretch. Knowing this, Kaken had thrown himself into training that aspect of his quirk as well, until he could start sparks without igniting the sweat. Of course, soon after came the ability to burn Izuku without leaving evidence on his clothes. As ingenious as it was, Izuku just wished he would figure out a way to practice without him. It was lucky the scars they left were small enough to be confused for freckles, but any more of them and it wouldn't be a convincing lie anymore. Heading back to his room, he rewrapped his shoulder before finally laying down to read recent hero news articles. He promised himself he'd go to bed after just a few articles, but he knew that was a lie. Some nights he didn't even sleep. It wasn't long before he noticed a new message from an unknown number. For a short while, he was afraid to open it, assuming it to be from one of his classmates. It had happened before, each time increasing the level of horror he felt when seeing the contents. Most of the time it was news articles and pictures of recent quirkless suicides. Other times it was just messages, with every new one increasing in creativity. Both of them managed to make him feel like shit. Eventually, however, he remembered giving Nedzu his contact, and he opened it. The message was small and cryptic, reinforcing everything he'd ever heard about the principal, but instead of feeling nervous or scared, however, he felt excited. He got to solve a puzzle made by Nedzu himself. Exhaustion completely forgotten, he raced to his computer, investigating ciphers and codes. The message itself had only been a series of numbers, separated into groups of 1 or 2. Underneath them another message soon appeared, only saying, "Let's see how well you know your analysis notebook." Smiley face. After getting over the absolutely horrible grammar, it took Izuku only a moment to realize what he'd meant. After all, a system of numbers that involve text? He could only think of one solution at the moment, and he hoped it was accurate. Taking the first number, he went to the corresponding page in his notebook. The next number he took to mean the line on the page, the third was the word in the line, and the fourth was either the beginning of the next clue or the letter in the word. Judging by the fact that every fourth letter was only a single digit, he took it to mean the latter. It landed on. Filled with even more excitement, he sped through the rest, barely pausing to rest on any one page as he glanced at the exact position on each. It took very little to get the full message, but when he did he could barely stop himself from jumping up and down in excitement once again. It rested on an unassuming sheet of otherwise blank paper. "Meet me at UA on Friday afternoon." Izuku was still excited, but then an abrupt realization struck him. How could Nedzu know the locations of each letter? Had he memorized the entire thing in the time it took for him to deliver it? Izuku was left in awe for a moment before another realization hit him. If this puzzle had been as easy as it was, despite Nedzu's incredible intelligence, did that mean that they would only get harder? His increasing excitement was dampened slightly by the reminder that Nedzu wouldn't want anything to do with him once he realized how useless Izuku was. Regardless, he pledged to enjoy it to the fullest while it lasted. He was getting the opportunity to learn under Nedzu, and he would take full advantage of the information he held. Wanting Friday to arrive faster, he jumped into bed, only to stay awake in speculation for several hours more. What would it be like? What would he want? By the time he fell into a light sleep, it was only just in time to get an hour or two of sleep before class. He definitely regretted it in the morning. Thanks to his exhaustion the next day, he was much less prepared for the onslaught of verbal abuse he received the moment he walked into the classroom. It seemed Kaken's words from the previous day had spread around, and by the sound of it he'd broken some sort of barrier. All around him, teasing repetitions and variations of "take a swan dive off the roof" were tossed around casually, save for a few small groups of people uneasily sitting in the corners. Izuku appreciated them, While they had learned long ago that defending him or even talking to him had severe consequences, they still offered him small smiles and refused to go along with whatever the rest of the students were doing at the time. On a few occasions he'd even spotted them waiting nearby when he woke up from a beating, only running away when they saw him get up. They weren't quite friends, but they were the closest he had. Softly groaning internally, he sat down and tried to ignore everything while simultaneously looking like he was on the verge of a breakdown. It wasn't too far from the truth, but to be honest he'd grown used to the insults and all manner of verbal abuse long ago. The fact that it had now progressed to something more serious changed little. Just like always, the bullies only wanted to get some sort of reaction out of him, and so long as it seemed like they were on the surface they wouldn't move on to anything more physical. Usually. As per usual, Kakin was the exception. He would launch attacks with no warning, with no reason at any time. There was no indication that he was on edge or that he was even thinking about it. It all happened on a whim, and that was what made him all the more dangerous. Luckily for him, Kakin didn't arrive until class had already started. As violent as he was also obsessed with his grades, so normally class time was off limits. It didn't stop the occasional glare or pencil projectile, but he could handle it. It was fine. Surprisingly, it took until the end of the day for things to escalate. He just started packing his things, excited to head over to UA, when Kakin stomped over to his desk. Izuka didn't notice until it was too late, twin explosions impacting the table in front of him. Fortunately he'd learned from the day before and had no notebooks there to burn, but the loud noise made him flinch back violently anyway. Looking around quickly, he saw that all students and even teachers had left. He looked back up, nervous. Hey, Kakin. What's the matter? The blonde said nothing, only glaring at him. They stayed there, green eyes downcast and red ones directed straight for his, until he finally broke the silence. Why'd you do it? Out of all the things Izuku had expected, a simple question was not one of them. Huh. Several more crackling explosions rang out. You know what I mean, Deku. Why did you run in to help the rat? There were heroes everywhere. And you're quirkless. So why? Izuku was stunned. A conversation this long without any bodily injuries? What were the chances? Plus, it looked like Kakin was genuinely curious, which was rare. His life wasn't normally interesting enough for that. His mind snapped back to the present suddenly, eyes taking note of the increasingly more impatient look on the other's face. He responded hastily. It just looked like he needed help. Plus, none of the heroes were doing anything about it. You saw them. The glare only intensified. He clearly didn't believe him. Izuku let out a soft sigh. I moved without thinking, okay? Silence stretched out once again, until he continued. I just couldn't stand seeing him in pain, when I could do something about it. My legs just started without my knowledge, and suddenly all I could do was try to pull him out. I know it wasn't any of my business, but isn't that the essence of a hero? Getting involved when you don't have to? Another silence stretched out. Finally, it became apparent that he had nothing else to say, and the blonde let out a short "Tch." Whatever, nerd. He walked out of the classroom without so much as another glance at him. Thoroughly perplexed but relieved about the somewhat peaceful turn of events, he hurried out of school through a back door and made it home without further encounters. He couldn't be late for his first visit to UA, after all. *******. It was surprisingly easy to get his mom to agree to him leaving, but Izuku suspected it was mostly just the prospect of her son having friends to go hang out with. It may have been stupid to lie about where exactly he was going, but his mom always looked uncomfortable when he spoke about being a hero, so he decided he wouldn't burden her with it. It was better that way, it always was. Quickly, he checked the schedule for the trains for the 10th time. Jumping off the final train, he rushed up to the imposing figure of UA. It was incredible. He'd dreamed about stepping foot on campus since he was a child. It was only a quick hand tugging him backwards at the last second that stopped him from being crushed by the giant gates. "Watch where you're going, kid," said a gruff voice. "You need a pass if you want to get through the gates." Izuku turned around, about to thank the man for tugging him out of the way, but he stopped when he saw who it was. Eraserhead. "Wow, I can't believe it's you. Can you sign my notebook?" He was practically jumping for joy, his notebook stretched out in front of him. He was only slightly put out by the curt no that followed, his enthusiasm having doubled from just the sight of the hero. "What are you doing here, anyway?" "Oh, Nedzu asked me to come. He wants to help train my analysis. I'm assuming since he didn't tell me anything about a key card that he wants me to figure out my own way in. Well, I hope I see you later, Eraserhead sir." With that, he turned and started to scope out the perimeter. He missed the slightly terrified look that Eraserhead threw after him before he made his way through the gate. He hadn't really thought about it before, but seeing as Nedzu hadn't sent someone for him or told him about the key cards, then he must have left a way in for him, and Izuku just had to figure it out. This looked like it was going to be fun. Of course, he'd already figured out a while ago that UA must have another entrance. It was, after all, more than just a school. In the case of a national emergency, it would become a fortress, capable of housing thousands of people. Izuku assumed there would be at least a few extra ways in, including one underground and another one possibly as simple as a door in the far back. Getting through the door would be another challenge, but he figured he'd cross that bridge when he got to it. It was very discreet when he did spot it. Only the slight difference in the grass below it gave any sort of indication that it wasn't just a solid wall. There were no visible seams, and no lock he could try picking. After a while he did find an indentation that was very nearly flush with the wall, shaped like a hand, but it did nothing when he touched it. He assumed it was some sort of fingerprint system, then, probably with a few other safety mechanisms for those that could copy and transform bodies. It took him even longer to find another indentation, mainly because it was so low on the wall. It almost felt like another handprint, but it was too small and the proportions were all off. With a start he realized it must be for Nedzu himself, and that was when he realized he might be on the wrong track. All of the options he'd seen so far required something he didn't have. So, what was something that both he and Nedzu shared? The only thing he could think of was a similar stature, since Izuku was still fairly short for his age. It made sense, then, that the entrance he was supposed to find was based more on size than identity. After all, Nedzu was the only being in the staff to be that small. It would probably have a few other forms of identification just in case, but it would probably be discreet enough to go unnoticed by the majority of people. Logically, that meant something that wouldn't seem out of place in the forest, like a small boulder or a tree. Another reasonable deduction was that it must be close to his office, in order to be a viable escape path. Izuku highly doubted the rodent would have made a secret entrance that was inconvenient to him. So, making his way to the east side of the campus, he got to searching once again. He went quickly, his eyes scanning everything at ground level for signs of something unnatural. Occasionally, he kicked his feet out to check that the trees were, indeed, made out of wood, but he had no luck in that method. Regardless, he continued, and eventually came across something that seemed out of place. Ahead of him, an ancient-looking tree twisted up from the ground. Now, alone it wasn't special. However, the roots were formed in a way that could be seen as a small staircase. Quickly and carefully he made his way over, clambering onto a knot that had formed in its center. Rapping his knuckles against every large surface, his face broke out into a large grin when a metallic clang echoed out instead of a dull thud. Finding two indentations next to the panel, he waited with bated breath, but it didn't open. Thinking hard, he looked down to find a small hole in the corner between the surface he was on and the door. A thought occurred to him, and he stuck his finger in, wriggling it around for a moment. He cheered internally when he found a latch and pulled it. Now, he stuck his other hand back in the indentation on the left, and without thinking stuck his head in the other, and the door swung open. It had been purely luck, remembering that Nedzu probably used his tail in the opening mechanism, but Izuku wasn't complaining. Just barely missing the yells coming from the surface, he jumped down a ladder, landing at what was approximately just below ground level, and started crawling down the path. He just couldn't get over how exciting this was. He was entering UA through an entrance that nobody but Nedzu, and now he knew about. The excitement died down a bit when he came across a three-way intersection that clearly looked like a maze. ********. His arms were exhausted by the time he saw light again. He had no way of knowing exactly how long it had been, but his mind landed on too long. He'd taken countless turns, attempting to make a mental map of the place, but he swore some of the passages moved around at random intervals. By the time he'd factored the movement into his mental maze, he was on the verge of giving up, but finally he made it out. In front of him, the passage extended so far he couldn't see the end, light coming in intermittently from what he assumed to be classrooms. He must be in the vents, then. Unsurprisingly, the first room was Nedzu's office. Heaving out a weary sigh, he moved to tap on the vents, but stopped at the last second when he realized Nedzu was talking to a very distraught present mic. "It's been hours, Nedzu. The little listener is lost, he has to be. I've scanned the entire perimeter, calling out his name, but he never showed up. We can't be liable for a child's disappearance, Nedzu." He seemed frantic, his hands digging into his hair in desperation. Izuku got a worrying thought. What if Nedzu hadn't intended for him to find the maze? Had he just worried everyone? No. He was getting kicked out, wasn't he? He'd screwed up. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised his hand and knocked on the grate of the vent a few times. Nedzu's ear twitched, but nobody turned around. He did it again, more forcefully. This time present Mike jumped, his eyes scanning the room before landing on the vent. "Present Mike, sir? I'm fine, Sorry for worrying you." Everything was silent for a moment, before present Mike whispered what sounded suspiciously like, "Oh no, another one," and ran out. Nedzu waited until the door closed behind him to start cackling. "You can come out now, Midoriya. There's a button next to the vent that opens it up some more." Finding the button, he made his way down quickly. Immediately he started apologizing. "Nedzu, I'm so sorry. I thought you wanted me to find my way in on my own, and I didn't even stop to think about it, and I made you and present Mike worry," and he was interrupted by a hot cup of tea being pushed into his hands, which he gratefully took. At Nedzu's gesturing, he took a seat, and they sat in silence for a little while, enjoying the calm. At last Nedzu spoke again. "While it is true that I didn't originally plan for you to find another entrance, I must say it was very entertaining. Your ingenuity has surprised me, Midoriya. And don't worry too much about worrying me or Yamada. As soon as you found the tree, I knew where you were, and I disabled some of the security protocols. I'll have to reprogram them soon to allow you in as well." He started tapping away at his keyboard, seemingly engrossed in his work. Izuku just sat there, stunned and confused about what he was supposed to do now. After a little while, Nedzu noticed. "Oh, how rude of me. I didn't give you anything to do." Leaning down, he stuck his paw down to rummage for a little while before he pulled out a packet of paper. "I originally planned for this to take the whole afternoon, but after your unplanned detour, I doubt you'll have the time. Don't worry, these are simply to see where you are academically. Feel free to answer them as quickly or slowly as you want, but do try your best. You'll have more time tomorrow." Plopping the packet down unceremoniously, Izuku took a curious look. As far as he could tell, it was just a simple mixed multiple choice and essay test, but knowing Nedzu, it was probably much more than that. Determined to impress him, he got to work. It didn't take long for him to find a rhythm, and he found himself actually enjoying it as well. It was nice to have company while he worked, and it helped that there was a fairly large section on quirk theory. Before long he was asking for more paper, something he normally never did, and even asking questions for clarification. Compared to his regular teachers, he just felt so much more comfortable around Nedzu, and he wasn't sure why, exactly. It was as though the rodent understood, more than anyone else, at least. He was so determined to impress his hopefully mentor that he completely forgot about time. By the time he finished the last question on his packet, an essay type about early quirk law, it was completely dark out. Not that he noticed, however. He was still absorbed in his packet, double-checking everything. He was interrupted by a knock followed by the swish of the opening door and a tired voice filtering in. "Nedzu, it's time to go home." Also, Hisashi was in near hysterics earlier. Did that have anything to do with that? He paused, staring straight at Izuku, who squirmed slightly under the attention. Suddenly, he turned on his heel and left, not bothering to say another word. Nedzu chuckled. Now reminded of the time, Izuku looked at his phone only to be met with a dozen frantic messages and 6 missed calls from his mom. He could barely contain his panic. "Nedzu, I need to get home. Are there any trains that leave soon? Maybe, but just one and it's too far away to reach in time, especially if I have to get through you. Maybe I should just walk? But dash. Not to worry, Midoriya. I know a way there. Follow me quickly. Embarrassed at getting his mumbling interrupted, he followed without complaint, leaving his test on Nedzu's desk. Though, instead of going towards the door, Nedzu motioned for him to join him behind his desk. He looked around, trying to spot whatever hidden mechanism was there among the clutter, when the floor dropped out from beneath him and his stomach flew into his mouth. He was only slightly embarrassed to admit he let out a very loud scream on the way. Fortunately, the platform they were on came to a gradual halt, instead of an abrupt one, and he found himself staring down a network of tunnels. In slight awe, he stepped off, marveling at the obviously well-maintained space. Behind him, Nedzu only let out a slight chuckle, hopping down to lead him down a series of seemingly random twists. He explained as they walked. These tunnels were built by my own orders not too long ago. They lie just below the sewer system, and few people know of their existence. Because of that, I found maintenance somewhat difficult to come by. That is, until I made the rule that Aizawa had to spend a full day down here for every student he expelled. They've been practically sparkling since. They came to a stop next to a ladder, and Nedzu continued. You should be able to climb this ladder to the sewers, and then to the manhole cover just next to the station. It's light enough for me to lift, so you shouldn't have any problems. Izuku started to climb. Next time I'll start teaching you where and how to get in, so that you can use it as a mode of commuting. I find them to be much easier to navigate and much less troublesome than the paths with people and obstacles. At this, Midoriya paused. When he spoke it was hesitant, shy. So, there will be a next time? Nedzu looked slightly affronted. Why, of course. You're a truly impressive individual, Midoriya Izuku. I'm not letting you go that easily. Midoriya laughed, short and bright. So I should come back tomorrow then? I'd like that very much. All right. He gave Nedzu another smile and kept making his way up. See you tomorrow. That night he slept more peacefully than he had in a long time. And despite his mother's scolding and the still fresh burn on his shoulder, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had begun to drastically change for the better. Melissa was just playing games on her phone when she got the call. It was much more anticlimactic than she would have expected or hoped, really, though she supposed that it was pretty typical of Uncle Might. That did nothing to diminish the absolute shock she felt when she picked up and the first thing he said was, "Do you want a quirk?" Next was a whirlwind of video calls with him and her dad present, learning all about One for All. At first, it seemed Uncle Might was perfectly happy to leave it at, "It's a stockpiling quirk that's been passed on to me, and I want to pass it on to you," but luckily her dad put a stop to that real quick. Soon enough, she knew the long, tortured history of what was once a struggling dispute between brothers. Despite this knowledge, however, how could she say no? It was a dream come true. Besides, she'd get to spend more time with her uncle and maybe even make friends her age. It was an offer she couldn't pass up, though she still thought long and hard about it before officially accepting. The sheer amount of physical activity that would have to go into it was definitely daunting. Nevertheless, she vowed to work for it. Her entire life had been spent working twice as hard as everyone else just to be taken seriously. 10 months of hell would be nothing. Not even 3 days after, she was touching down in Japan. She'd known, logically, that her uncle had gone through some rough changes, and the video calls had shown as much. Still, that did little to prepare her for what she actually saw. He looked gaunt, thin, like a scarecrow had come to life, and it scared her that someone so strong could be hurt so badly. At least she didn't have to deal with the villain who did it. The first few days had been a bit awkward. She hadn't seen him in so long, and it seemed he didn't really know how to interact with teenagers, so they'd been at a bit of an impasse during the time she spent getting settled. But she had a lot of questions, and they were bound to come out eventually. Her final breaking point had been during a weirdly silent dinner. "Uncle Might," she'd started. He looked up, startled. "Yes?" She turned the question around for a bit in her head. She couldn't back out now. She knew her uncle, and if she just said never mind, he'd push until he got to the root of the problem. So instead she considered the question, trying to figure out the best way to frame it. I'm extremely grateful for your offer, and I'm not second-guessing my answer, but she trailed off for a moment. I guess I was just wondering, why so sudden? We hadn't seen each other in so long, and then just out of the blue, you offer me your quirk. What happened? He looked slightly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Oh God, she wouldn't like the answer, would she? That was in no way a promising reaction to her question. Is it? I've been looking for a successor for some time now. And recently someone made me realize that I wasn't looking for someone worthy, I was looking for someone I could mold into a copy of myself. I wanted for my legacy to last, and I wanted to keep living, keep saving people, through someone else. It was wrong, and so I realized I needed someone strong, someone kind, someone smart and capable enough to mold this quirk into their own. He met her eyes. And when I thought of all of these things, your face was the first one that came to mind. I may be a tad biased, but I can think of no one better to start their own legacy, their own era of peace. I had no other plan in place should you have said no, and I cannot tell you how grateful I am that it worked out. By the time he ended his impromptu little speech, Melissa was blushing furiously, trying to deny his claims. Nevertheless, she accepted the answer, and things grew noticeably less tense afterwards. For a few more days, Melissa was given space to explore her new home. She was way too shy to try and make friends out of nowhere, but she definitely enjoyed sightseeing in the city she'd spend the next 4 or so years in. One thing, though, that still confused her was why they hadn't started training yet. She got her answer when she returned one day to find her uncle holding a stack of papers titled Liberty Exercise Regiment or something similarly cheesy. She was tempted to laugh until she started leafing through it. The mere thought of going through a third of the things listed was enough to make her limbs feel like jelly. The food looked good at least, but how on earth was she going to get through this? She gritted her teeth. There was no how, only when and where. She would get through this and she'd come out stronger than ever. She still cursed herself for accepting a few days later when she had to drag a fridge down the beach with an already aching body. *******. She first spotted him about a week into her training. It was towards the end of the day, after she'd already exhausted herself to the very brink and didn't have the energy to get up. She was lying down in the sand, just far enough from the waves to avoid getting any more than damp, with an enormous wall of garbage sprawling on her other side. It was nice, secluded, and one of the small sections she'd managed to clear of metal bits, so she figured it was as good a place as any to rest while her uncle cooked her dinner. She felt slightly guilty about not helping, especially since he himself couldn't eat much of it, but she just couldn't muster the strength to get up unless she knew food was already waiting. Her thoughts were interrupted by a small, persistent noise coming from somewhere behind all the garbage. At first she thought it was a bug, but was soon corrected when she made out a few words. The muttering got louder, and she feared the owner would discover her, but it seemed to stop somewhere beyond the closest wall. She let out a small sigh of relief. She was too mentally drained to deal with an actual person that wasn't Uncle Mite. She was, however, curious as to what someone else would be doing around here. As far as she knew, there was zero reason to even approach the beach unless, wait, were they here to litter? That would be just her luck. More work for later. Hopefully it wasn't anything too big, or she would be tempted to get up just to punch them. The muttering continued, however, and eventually she tried to make out the words against her better judgment. She knew it was private, but what if they were planning something? As a future hero, wasn't it her job to pay attention to these things to stop more problems from happening? Content with her thought process, she tuned into the stream of words that was becoming increasingly more distinct. It took considerable effort, but she was able to make out about 1 out of every 2 words. Maybe? No, missing, precarious, I'd have to, maybe if I move this? The only warning Melissa got was a small screeching noise produced by metal scraping other metal before it all toppled over onto her. She let out a startled scream, and the muttering stopped. She didn't notice, however, too preoccupied putting her hands up as shields from the large amount of very sharp things suddenly falling onto her face. She also wasn't able to stop the string of very creative curses she let out. "Are you okay? Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't know you were there. Can you hear me? Are you hurt? I'm going to get you out of there. Just hold on dash, the words just kept on coming, and funnily enough it distracted her from the pain enough for her to not struggle and make things worse while he dug her up. Seemed to be taking considerable effort, however, if the grunts at every small piece were anything to go by. Little by little the removed debris revealed a head of dark green hair and even brighter green eyes. Soon she realized why he was taking so long. He was built like a twig and was definitely shorter than her. Somehow he was in even worse shape than she was, which made her feel a little better about her current situation. Enough trash cleared, she reluctantly obliged when he told her to sit up, and was surprised to see sterilized gauze and an antiseptic spray held out already. Without stopping his stream of panicked, apologetic words, his hands moved to calmly clean and bandage the various cuts she'd received, all of which were thankfully fairly shallow. They felt professionally done, perfectly snug against her skin without being too tight. Idly she wondered if he was training to be a paramedic. Her head snapped up from examining her bandages when she caught the tail end of what he was saying. "And anyway, I have to go now. I'm so sorry again for the injuries. I hope the bandages feel alright. Okay, bye." "Wait dash," she tried calling out to him, but he was already hurrying over the mounds of unidentifiable bits and bobs to reach to residential area near the beach. She sighed in disappointment before picking herself up and making her way home, not at all excited at the prospect of explaining her injuries. At least they were already taken care of. Dash asterisk asterisk dash asterisk asterisk. In the days that followed, the green bush at the top of his head became a fairly common sight up and down the beach. Luckily, his times rarely coincided with her uncle's. Normally she'd spot Greenie, her nickname for him, since she had nothing else to call him in her head, in the late afternoons, just as she was about to head back to have dinner. She knew that he was nearly unrecognizable in his small mite form, but still, it was her opinion that he couldn't be too careful. It wasn't like it was a secret he could go shouting from the rooftops, or telling to every fan who asked. As unlikely as it was, he shouldn't risk someone seeing him and putting it all together. Encounters with her, however, were far more common. If not for him seemingly avoiding her, they would have run into each other at least half a dozen times per day, but for the most part he stuck to the fringes, picking at things only he could see. Sometimes he brought a bag with him, and would leave with it noticeably bigger than before. Often he even struggled with carrying it, though that didn't surprise her quite as much. His arms were the size of PVC. She would have been perfectly content to continue to ignore each other, but she'd been lonely. For weeks now it had only been her and her uncle, and though she loved him, it was getting tiring. She needed to talk to someone her own age, even if it did look like he was at least a couple years younger. Plus, she was extremely curious to find out what he was doing on the beach so often. So one day, when she saw him about to leave the beach with his mysterious bag, she cornered him. Well, cornering sounded a bit aggressive. She just stood at the point for beach access, knowing there wasn't any other way off or onto the beach. Leaning on a fence, she waited. And waited. And waited. Before she knew it, almost an hour had already passed. Quickly looking over the beach, she failed to spot the telltale tangle of green curls. Had he figured out another way off the beach? If so, why? Was he so intent on avoiding social interaction in general, or was it just her? The next day she attempted the same method, but kept an eye on him. Still, he managed to somehow disappear into the mounds of scrap and didn't reappear. Day after day Melissa waited, now less intent on befriending him and more focused on solving the mystery. Where could he be going? The entirety of the beach was still covered, as far as she could tell, save for a few spots she'd managed to clear on her own. However, judging by the fact that he disappeared in approximately the same spot every day, she decided to check it out. The following few days she made excuses with her uncle so she could slowly but surely shift her efforts to that particular area. It took a while, and she came no closer to catching him in that time, but finally she'd carved a path precariously leading to her objective. And then one day, finally, she fully uncovered something. It was an opening, one that could only be the mysterious exit he'd been using, and it was just a sewage drain. At least it didn't really smell. It seemed this one had been sealed off when the garbage had appeared or sometime around then. It wasn't the cleanest, but it was in decent shape for having spent years buried under trash. But the question remained, how was he using it to leave? And more importantly, why? That same day she waited there instead, hiding slightly out of view behind what used to be some sort of appliance. Soon enough she heard light footsteps, but the mutter wasn't present. She stepped out just as he was about to reach the entrance. "Hi," she said, enthusiastically. She was happy to finally catch him, and excited to find out what he'd been doing. It was pretty shady, to be honest, but he didn't seem like the kind of guy to be involved in anything too bad. Hopefully. Gah. He jumped, dropping his bag onto the ground. Various metal pieces spilled out, seemingly scrapped from larger hardware. Quickly he bended over to pick them up, and Melissa joined him. She spoke as she did. "Sorry about that, I've just been really curious about what you've been up to recently. And why would you choose to leave through the sewage drain? How did you even find it, anyway? It was covered in stuff." He looked at her, surprised. "That's why you've been waiting for me at the entrance? Because you were curious?" "Well, yeah. Why else?" He shifted slightly. "I thought you were mad at me. You know, for the whole dropping a mountain of garbage on Yuch thing." She blinked. "So you've been avoiding me because you thought I was mad at you?" Sheepishly he nodded. Oh. She didn't think of herself as particularly intimidating, but to be fair he was pretty small. "Well, now that that's cleared up, what have you been doing?" He glanced to the side as though trying to avoid the conversation. "If I do, will you tell me what you've been doing? I see you here every day, and as far as I know that's not exactly normal." She huffed. "Fine, but I asked first." He sighed. "I've been collecting parts to start learning how to make support gear. It's fascinating, and could really end up helping me in the long run." "Help you? With what?" The question seemed to make him nervous. "I want to be a hero." "Really? Me too." His head snapped up, clearly interested now. "Is that what you've been doing here? Training?" "Yeah. I need more muscle training, so I've been cleaning the beach." He looked over the expanse and then back at her. "That seems a bit ambitious." Her eye twitched. She knew logically that he wasn't underestimating her. Hell, there was no way he could know about her lack of quirk. Still it felt that way. "Don't worry. I have a professional training me, and he's confident I'll make it in time." He perked up again. "In time for what?" With no small amount of pride, she answered. "The UA entrance exam." She was expecting awe or maybe jealousy, but instead she got something else entirely. "That's great. I'm going to be taking the recommendation exam. I hope I see you in class." The recommendation exam? That was an option? She wondered if it would be better for her to try that one. She'd have to ask Uncle Mite about that later. She was snapped out of her musings when the boy, she still didn't know his name, started to walk into the sewer drain. Reflexively, her hand shot out to grab his wrist. "Wait." He turned around, confused. "There may have been another reason I wanted to talk to you." His eyebrows furrowed. "You see, I'm new to Japan, and I don't really know anyone my age, so, do you want to be friends?" She cringed slightly at how sad it sounded. His mouth opened and closed a few times, and he looked down at his feet. Her heart sank. Did he not want to? Did he think she was weird? She knew she didn't talk to many people her age, but was it really that obvious? "I'm quirkless." It was muttered quietly, so quietly that she almost didn't hear it. It still took her a moment to process, and when she did, she was left with more questions than answers. Why did it matter? Somehow, though, she suspected that saying that wouldn't quite help. "So am I," she said instead. His head shot up at record speed. "Really?" he breathed. Again she was confused. Wasn't around 20% of the population quirkless? Sure, she knew that most of those were in the older generations, but it couldn't be so rare that he hadn't met anyone else like him, right? Still, she just nodded. Though, remembering what exactly she was training for, she panicked and quickly tried to amend the previous statement. "Well, at least I think so. According to my mentor, it's possible that I have a latent quirk that requires certain muscle mass to activate, so it doesn't hurt me. That's part of why I'm going through so much effort now. If I train starting now, it's possible that by the time the entrance exam comes around it finally activates. Of course, there's no guarantee, but I'm still hoping." She hoped her rambling hadn't been too suspicious, but when she saw him furiously scribbling in a notebook he'd produced from somewhere, she knew she wouldn't have to worry too much. He'd started to mutter, and from what she could make out he was going over the limitations of her power, the chances it existed, and something called quirk singularity. Vaguely she recognized the term from one of her dad's colleagues, but she was more into stuff that she could touch and experiment with. Maybe she could offer help with his support gear? That's something a friend would do, right? First, though, she needed to get home, and she was fairly sure the same was true for him. Gently, she nudged him into a slow walk where she led him through the frankly extremely dangerous path she'd cut through the garbage until they reached the entrance to the beach. He hadn't stopped muttering or writing the entire time. Patiently she waited for him to stop writing, and slowly he realized he was no longer where he'd been when he started. She was tempted to laugh at the bewildered look on his face, but opted instead for sticking her hand out. I don't think I ever introduced myself. I'm Melissa Shield. Or, Shield Melissa? That is how you say your name's here, right? He chuckled slightly as he took her hand. Belatedly, she also realized that the custom for introductions was different as well, but it seemed the boy knew her well enough. I'm Midoriya Izuku. It's nice to meet you, Shield. It felt weird being called by her last name, but she was worried that if she told him to call her by her first he'd feel pressured to offer the same. They exchanged numbers and promised to see each other the next day. Just as she was about to walk away, however, he came running back. Wait, he said between pants. Shield? As in David Shield? As in the most famous support gear producer in the world. She was vaguely surprised he hadn't brought up All Might. He seemed like a big fanboy. As she answered question after question from the excited boy, all she could think of was how nice it'd be to have someone to talk to. Things were looking up, she thought, and it was looking to be an exciting several months. She couldn't wait. She realized later that she'd never gotten an answer for why he always left through the sewers, but she supposed she'd have plenty of opportunities to ask again. She was proven right when the next day she found him waiting for her at the exit from the beach. It took little time at all to settle into a routine. It may have been a bit awkward at first, but soon enough they had a comfortable dynamic, taking turns to talk animatedly about their respective interests. Already Midoriya had a full several pages on pure speculation about her quirk, including estimates on power output based on her current strength and the strength she needed to activate it for the first time. It was scarily accurate, especially when considering the fact that he'd even estimated the height she could reach at full output with a simple jump. Similarly, Melissa already had dozens of sketches and blueprints drawn up for gear she thought he might need. She'd made a few for herself, of course, but her focus was on him and the sheer amount of functionality she could shove into as small a frame as possible. It was a fun challenge, and it helped to teach Midoriya a bit about how the gear worked. Currently she had a flamethrower, grappling hook, and retractable claws in a single lightweight gauntlet. In theory, that is, they lacked the materials and tools to actually make them before UA. For Melissa, this was a dream come true. Not only did she finally have someone her age to talk to, they also shared many of the same interests. Or at least they overlapped. From the way he'd acted when he said he was quirkless, she suspected he didn't have many other friends, so she hoped the feeling was mutual. Over the course of the last few months, there had been a few times he hadn't showed up to the beach at all. On those days, Melissa walked home a bit early to help her uncle make dinner. He was always apologetic the next day, frantically explaining that he'd had some extra schoolwork to take care of, but it always felt like he was withholding some information. She didn't pry, but she was curious. Why was he so secretive? Regardless, there were just so many slightly strange things about him that she forgot about it after not too long. She'd been so focused on the weird aspects of his life that she'd forgotten to even consider that she might have some oddities about her as well. Part of it was in the constant questions about what Island was like, but occasionally a question caught her off guard. So, if your dad's still there, who are you living with here? Oh, it's just me and Uncle M. She cleared her throat. Uncle Yagi. She cursed her slip-up, but he didn't seem to notice it. He stayed silent beside her, either in deep consideration or drawing up the courage to say something. She waited patiently. Finally, he spoke again. My mom's been asking me to invite you over for dinner. If that's okay with you, of course. I'm not sure if you even want to, but you could bring your uncle, and she makes the best katsudon, but there's no pressure if you don't want to, I'd understand. She cut his mutter storm off before he could get in too deep. I'd love to. And I'm sure my uncle would too. He breathed an audible sigh of relief, which she politely ignored and smiled. Glancing at his watch, he yelped, and in a storm of hasty goodbyes he left, tearing down a side street. She huffed a laugh. It was a nice offer. Despite phrasing it in a way that suggested his mom had asked him to do it, she knew that was more than likely just a sort of defense mechanism in case she'd refused. His self-esteem was absolutely horrible, she'd realized a while back, but she could read between the lines of his anxiety. She was looking forward to eating something other than her uncle's fairly limited menu. Finally reaching the decent-sized apartment she shared with the man in question, she fished the keys out of her pocket. It was her third pair of new jeans since she'd gotten to Japan. Apparently the combination of intense exercise and carefully calculated meals had brought on a growth spurt, which, combined with a large increase in muscle mass, had created the need for new clothes pretty quickly. Though, some had to be bought simply because working near a lot of sharp things tended to ruin whatever she was wearing if she wasn't careful. At least she had strong gloves. "I'm home," she yelled. The first time she'd called the place home, without thinking, Yagi had burst into tears of joy, not unlike Midoriya's reaction to her calling him a friend a few weeks back. She smiled fondly, thinking back to her panic at the time. It had taken a while for him to calm down enough to explain the Midoriya tears. "Just in time. I'm trying something new today, as a treat. I think you've earned it, young Melissa. The beach is nearly halfway done, and you still have 6 months to the exam." Melissa blushed slightly at the praise. It hadn't been just her. Lately, after a bit of prodding, Midoriya had agreed to help, if only for a bit of extra strength training and the possibility of finding better materials for his gear. He had yet to show her any designs, but she was excited to find out how much he'd learned. Apparently people in the recommendation exam could bring in gear that they themselves made, so it would be crucial for him to hurry on some. Speaking of the recommendation exam, she understood why she couldn't take it. She did. For the exam you needed a sponsor, and if that sponsor was All Might himself, then it'd be all over the news by the next day. Still, she was a bit bitter. It would have been nice to take the exam with her friend, and it was supposedly a bit less physically taxing. Well, at least her strength training was going well. With any luck, she'd be able to train with the quirk for about a week before the test at the rate she was going. "Is there something on your mind, Melissa?" She started. Without noticing, she'd stopped eating, her chopsticks twirling around on the plate. Looking up, she came face to face with a very worried-looking Yagi. "If you don't like it, I'd be happy to make you something else." "No. It's great, you don't have to do that." To prove her point, she shoveled a large amount into her mouth. It really was good food. Still, she regretted this a moment later when she was barely able to chew. When it was finally in her stomach, she finally spoke. "Hey, you know how I told you about a friend I made on the beach?" Now her uncle's mouth was full. He gestured for her to keep going. "Well, he invited me, Liz, to dinner with his mom. I'm not sure when, because he had to get home before he told me, but I'm sure he'll send me a message any second now." As though on cue, her phone buzzed a few times. She opened it to find a couple of panicked apologies, and she smiled softly. "Is Friday okay? He sent me the address, and it's not too far from here." Her uncle sat up straighter. "That's fine, Melissa. I'm glad you're making friends. But you're sure he won't find out about?" He gestured at himself vaguely. "This?" She considered for a moment. As smart as he is, he can be a bit oblivious at times. He chuckled. "I know some people like that. What did you say his name was?" "It's Izuku Midoriya." Somehow, her uncle's face paled even more than usual. "Do you know him?" She was confused. What reason would he have to react that way? She saw him swallow. "No, I must be mistaken. I doubt your friend is the same one I'm thinking of." He still looked pale, but significantly less so. He shook himself slightly. "I can't. But I'm sure they're lovely. You should be fine. I should tell him about your restrictions. I know he'd feel horrible if he invited you over and you couldn't even eat." She ignored his slight protests at anything he considered an inconvenience caused by him, and got up to wash her plate. This would be fun. She wondered what his mom was like. Considering the term Midoriya tears, she had somewhat of an idea. Still, she was excited, if a little confused by Uncle Might's reaction to his name. She wondered if she'd ever meet this other Izuku Midoriya. She'd ask him if there was any relation the next day, if she remembered. She didn't. Dash asterisk asterisk dash asterisk asterisk. After what felt like a very long week, she was finally on her way to the Midoriya household. She'd finished up her work a bit early, in time to shower and change before heading over, and it only took them about 15 minutes to reach it. Climbing up the stairs a bit faster than her uncle, she rang the bell so that the door would be open and waiting for when he reached the level. When he was muscled up, he was generally fine, but after spending 3 hours running around town kicking ass, even climbing some stairs was enough to wind him. The door opened to reveal a short, plump, kind-looking woman with the same dark green hair she'd come to recognize on her son, if a bit lighter. She watched as her gaze slowly traveled upwards, landing on her face. "You must be Shield." Izuku wasn't joking when he said you were tall. Come in. He'd just setting the table. Melissa was led into a small, cozy-looking apartment. It seemed to be about half the size of hers and Yagi's but much more lived in. She loved it. "Is your uncle joining us?" "Oh, yes, he just has slight difficulties climbing so many stairs. He'll be up in no time." Slowly she positioned herself in view of the open door so that he wouldn't miss it. "Oh dear. Is his condition really that bad? Should I send Izuku to help him?" She was wringing her hands, peering out of the door down the stairs. "Don't worry, he's just a bit tired. I'm sure he's almost here." She continued talking to Inko for a short while, before a shout interrupted it. "Shield. You made it." It was still weird responding to her last name, but she was getting used to it. "Midoriya. Thanks for inviting us." She directed this last part to both of them, giving a light bow. She hoped she wasn't being rude. Inko chuckled slightly. "Of course. When I found out that my Izuku had a friend, well, she started tearing up. I just couldn't wait to meet you." Suddenly she burst into tears, and in seconds her son was there with what looked like a bath towel. He held it under her eyes until it stopped. "We're happy to have you. You're going to love the food, my mom makes the best katsudon." He trailed off, something unusual for him. Most of the time his mutter storms were never-ending if not for some sort of interruption, which she soon spotted. Following Midoriya's eyes, she turned around to see a similarly frozen Uncle Might. They stared at each other for what seemed like a very long time, until Midoriya broke it with a smile so wide it must have hurt his eyes. "Hi. You must be Shield's Uncle Yagi I've heard so much about. It's great to meet you." He bowed in front of him, and her uncle bowed back, if a bit delayed. While Midoriya's seemed natural, her uncle's was stiff, his entire being tense. Now that she looked closer, actually, she noticed how tense Midoriya's shoulders were, as well. What was going on? It appeared Inko had noticed as well, but didn't have as much success in hiding it. Awkwardly, she led her uncle into the dining room, where a delicious-smelling meal had been laid out. She offered some water, which he accepted in a small voice, and they sat down to eat. Melissa and Inko did their best, but it was difficult for her to concentrate on the conversation with all the tension surrounding the other two occupants of the room. They refused to look up, only staring at their food and sometimes asking to be passed something else. It was affecting Melissa's ability to enjoy the amazing food in front of her, and it was testing her patience. At one point Inko excused herself to the bathroom, and that was when Melissa had enough. Loudly, she put down her chopsticks, startling everyone into looking at her. "Perfect. Alight, what's going on with the two of you? Because I swear, if you don't get the hell over it and let me enjoy this food, you're each getting stabbed with a chopstick." They both blinked, met each other's eyes and quickly looked away. Opening their mouths to speak at the same time, they stopped to gesture to the other to continue. Then, both having taken that as a sign to speak, they both directed simultaneous questions at Melissa. Both felt like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you tell me your uncle was All Might? Why didn't you tell me your friend was Nedzu's personal student? What?" And then she wanted an explanation. Which, how exactly am I going to do that? "Oh hey, that uncle you're always telling me about? Yeah, he crushed my dreams and left me on a rooftop. Alone. Immediately after a villain attack that left me unconscious. I can't do that to her." Nedzu chuckled into his tea as his young student paced the office, loudly complaining about his encounter with the number one hero. Plus, it distracted me too much to enjoy the Katsudon. I'll never forgive him. Nedzu stopped himself from laughing any longer, it bordering on maniacal, and instead set down his cup. Gently, he got Midoriya's attention. Please don't worry about any of that. I was sure to give him a very severe scolding, along with some more serious punishments for what he did and failed to do that day. He thought fondly to the compilation of camera feeds depicting him waking Aizawa for his classes. It was a job reserved for whoever Nedzu was angriest at the time, though he didn't let any one person hold it for too long. Chio could only put up with so many visits from staff, after all. Midoriya. He interrupted the muttering and the pacing, his student coming to a stop in the center of the room. I want you to think of this as an opportunity instead. He tilted his head quizzically. An opportunity? How so? An opportunity to practice diplomacy, acting, and lying. You don't want to tell Melissa so as to not create tension among your friendship and in her own personal life, correct? So play the part of someone who just so happens to have had a vaguely uncomfortable experience with the man, instead of something life-changing. He sipped his tea. It could be as simple as him refusing to sign your notebook, or insulting your sketches. Of course, you'll have to factor in the fact that somewhere in the story, his skinny form was revealed to you. Anyway, he chuckled slightly as he saw his student furiously scribbling notes in a notebook he hadn't seen before. This also gives you experience with working with people you don't necessarily like. I, for example, am used to working with the HPSC, despite the fact that they're blatant quirkists and that if I wanted to, they'd cease to exist by next week. It's simply too important for public stability, unfortunately, though I do hope we get a chance to do it together in the next few years. Midoriya chuckled slightly. Suddenly he shot up, expression alert and eager. Speaking of taking down quirkist institutions, I got the information you asked for. He handed over a USB, not interrupting his stream of words. It was a bit difficult to get into the physical records to scan them, but luckily I'm small enough that they don't even notice me unless they want to kick me or something. Nedzu frowned slightly. But the digital stuff was easy. Their defenses are absolute shit. Also, I now officially have a direct link to half the cameras in school, so even if they try to delete things I can save them onto my computer. Nedzu narrowed his eyes. His protégé was acting much too calm for someone who just handed over mountains of evidence for their own abuse. He scrutinized him for a moment, before sighing. Midoriya, I thought I told you not to put on your mask when you're in here. Abruptly his smile fell, revealing tired eyes and a worried brow. How did you know? His voice was still vaguely chipper, but faded into something more neutral towards the end of the sentence. Again, Nedzu sighed. Midoriya, what you just did, what you've been doing, is something that most people wouldn't be able to. The subject of your own abuse is never pleasant business, as nice as revenge often feels. He moved to the other side of his desk, laying a paw on his shoulder. His height made it slightly awkward, but he could manage. I know you've been getting better about it all, but there's still over a decade of internalized quirkism to get over, not to mention mounds of other trauma. Intelligence isn't the cure to everything. Sometimes, in fact, it makes things like this worse. But as long as you remember that you have people who support you, you'll do fine. Now, he finished, show me your latest gadget design. What have you found at Dagoba recently? Immediately Midoriya brightened, launching into an in-depth explanation of his latest design, utilizing the scraps he'd found to start work on a grappling hook. Nedzu knew that Melissa had already come up with several more and much better, more detailed designs, but Midoriya had insisted on only using gadgets he'd designed himself for the exam. That was the purpose of his new foray into support equipment. Applicants were allowed to bring anything they made themselves, provided they brought proof and they weren't dangerous for the other applicants. This was why Nedzu had suggested he begin doing independent research, which had led him to where he got his materials. Nedzu had expressed his willingness to simply buy him what he needed, but the boy was adamant he make it in without external help beyond what Nedzu was already providing. Some loan tools and a space to work aside, he had nothing to really work with. So, he'd found Dagoba, a place that Nedzu knew about for its large entrance to his tunnel system, Uncovering the entrance and finding out that the beach was being cleaned had Nedzu looking forward to a time that he could just take a short walk down to the beach uninterrupted. As Midoriya eagerly explained his thought process along with the obstacles he'd encountered, his door opened a crack and Midnight poked her head through. She opened her mouth to speak, but he silenced her with a glance, nodding to his student. He smiled in a way that his staff had described as unhinged, and internally laughed as she very slowly closed the door again, as though afraid that if she made a noise that she'd be noticed by the other occupant of the room. The boy was oblivious to it all. Nedzu couldn't remember the last time he felt this comfortable around a human being. Still paying attention to the ramblings, he reflected that it was most likely the parallels between the two of them, extremely intelligent minds, repressed and ostracized for something out of their control, abused by the hands that were once their friends. His expression soured and he shook himself, paying fuller attention to his student. It would do no good to think of such depressing things right now. What mattered is that they found each other, and that he was in a position to help. And help he would. Only a couple weeks after their first meetup, once Nedzu had gotten over the frankly astounding test scores, he'd begun to notice a pattern, and it was one he very much did not like. Limping, flinching, avoiding certain topics. Sometimes, Nedzu even spotted the edge of a bandage peeking out of a sleeve, though Midoriya was always careful to keep them as hidden as possible. It had made him curious, and within hours he already had a myriad of compiled evidence against Aldra and every one of its teachers. He was glad he hadn't found anything on Midoriya Inko. He was in no way ready to take care of a teenager. It took no small amount of restraint to stop himself from sending it all to the police immediately, but he refrained when some of his memories resurfaced. Back when he'd escaped, it had brought a large sense of closure to be the one to take down the facility that had imprisoned him in the first place. He'd studied enough human psychology by now to know that it would most likely be beneficial to Midoriya as well, but he would have to take things slowly. And so, he'd begun to teach him hacking as well as stealth. Nedzu may not be very strong, but he knew how to get around without being noticed, and he knew that his student would have an even easier time, especially considering the fact that he was so average-looking. Soon, he was planning on bringing in Tsukachi for a bit of detective training, but that was still a little ways away. And so, under Nedzu's guidance, he began to methodically take down his own school. Every incident involving him or even another weak quirked or mutation student was recorded and compiled, dates registered, audio cleared up, names were tied to infractions, background were checked, and information was saved before it could be deleted. The most frustrating part of it all, though, was one Bakugu Katsuki, Aldra's golden boy. Nedzu knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this boy was responsible for most, if not all, of the trauma and fear instilled in his student. But there was no evidence of his actions, nothing he could reasonably use to prove anything. It was as though after the slime incident, he'd mellowed out, letting others do what he had done himself for so long. It frustrated Nedzu to no end, especially since his record was completely clean and any previous records and video footage had long since been erased by the staff. Not only was it infuriating, it was insanely illegal, something he told his student to look into. Still, it had worked, and so unless Bakugu suddenly went back to his old ways it seemed he'd get off scot-free. When he'd found out, Nedzu had growled, silently vowing to reject his application for the hero course if it came his way. He was still an educator, so Gen Ed, business and support were still open, but the hero course would not be. He'd have to prove himself if he wanted things to go his way. Still, things were going remarkably well. Sure, Midoriya still had a hard time dealing with certain things, and Nedzu had encouraged him to sit down for a few sessions with Hound Dog, but the sheer difference between the timid, anxious boy he'd met several months ago and the cunning, nearly confident boy in front of him now was nothing short of a miracle. Nedzu was sure that by the time the exams rolled around he'd be able to pass the recommendation exam with flying colors. And I even started designing a mouth guard. It has a transparent display for information gathering, and I was able to make it spit fire for short periods of time. He trailed off slightly, voice having lost some of its excitement towards the end. But Nedzu didn't really notice that. Instead, he asked a different question. Why fire? Isn't that a bit difficult to add to the mechanisms, aside from being slightly impractical? Nedzu regretted his words when he saw Midoriya shrink into himself, suddenly full of doubt. I'm sure there's a reason, Midoriya. Would you like to share it? You don't have to, of course. Hesitantly, as though debating the merits of telling him, he continued speaking. Well, it was my dad's quirk. The last part was spoken just above a whisper, but Nedzu heard it nevertheless. His eyes widened in understanding. That's perfectly fine then, Midoriya. I fully understand the wish to have a reminder of your family when you work. If you need any help with it, please don't hesitate to ask. He straightened up a bit, smiling. He wasn't quite back to how relaxed he was before Nedzu's question, but it was better. I'm good, Nedzu. Thanks. Nedzu placed a cup of tea in front of him, and he took the cue to sit down across from him. How about I teach you how to lie? I'm sure you'll have great use for it soon. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the slightest hint of fabric through the vents, and he laughed. Aizawa, if you wish to take part in the lessons, all you need to do is ask. Frantic movements sounded down the vent, and soon faded completely. Chuckling, he looked back to see Midoriya's notebook magically reappeared, the boy in question leaning forward eagerly. Later that day, when their class had ended, Nedzu watched as Midoriya successfully convinced some train station operators that he'd accidentally lost his ticket, getting a free ride home. He loved how quickly Midoriya picked up new skills. *******. All the tips on lying in the world couldn't prepare Izuku mentally for what he was about to do. It was one thing lying to people he didn't know, it was quite another to tell Melissa, his best friend, that what had happened between him and her uncle had been something entirely different. Walking down to the beach, his lonely steps echoing through the tunnels, he thought back to the disaster that had been dinner. After Izuku's question, seriously, what had he been thinking then? Why would he reveal that he knew about Small Might? Melissa had just stared at the two of them, dumbfounded. Eventually, before she could respond, his mom had showed up, and the conversation was tabled, no pun intended. All Might had made a beeline for the door immediately afterwards, citing troubles with medication, and Melissa had said goodbye with perhaps the most confused face he'd ever seen on anyone. Of course, his mom had asked him about it while they were cleaning up, and he excused it with something vague about having met the man at a hero fight. He wondered if that would work with Melissa, too. Actually, the more he thought about it, it might be perfect. He could say that he was in the crowd, making commentary about the fight, and they'd gotten into an argument about the way they were doing things. It escalated slightly, with Izuku citing something All Might had done that went similarly, and the man buffed up for a moment to yell, "I am All Might." He could say that everyone was too focused on the fight to notice, and that Izuku had received an explanation soon afterwards along with being forced to promise not to leak the information. That works, he thought. There was no telling how All Might himself would react, but that was just another hurdle to face. With any luck the man would go along with it, but honestly Izuku had no clue. Still he hoped for the best. Climbing up the ladder to the beach, he emerged just next to the sewer pipe, something he was extremely grateful for. There was a small hole, just small enough for him to fit through comfortably, nested just under the rest of the pipe, allowing him to keep up the appearance of having emerged from it while still staying dry and clean. Finally clambering out, hauling his small yellow backpack out from the hole behind him, he pretended to scavenge for materials, knowing full well that Melissa would spot him sometime soon and come over for an explanation. He grunted as he picked up a washing machine, moving it somewhere more stable. While he hadn't achieved anywhere near the definition his friend had, he was still amazed at how quickly he'd increased his strength. He had a few theories as to why, most of them centering on his quirkless status, but nothing concrete yet. If he was right, though, it would mean that quirkless people were in no way less evolved, instead just having branched off in a completely other direction from quirk usage. It was fascinating to think about, especially considering that his parents were both quirked, meaning that the two subspecies were, in fact, dominant or recessive genes. Probably. He should go to Nedzu with his theories. He was interrupted by a voice yelling into his ear. Nothing intelligible or important, just straight "Aya." Groaning, he turned around. "Hey, Melissa. Was that really necessary?" She smiled smugly. Yes, it was. It's what you get for making dinner so awkward. Hey, that wasn't just me. Her smile became slightly more dangerous. Alright. That reminds me. You two need to talk. Izuku turned around, stomach sinking, though already knowing what to expect. Behind Melissa, seemingly trying to hide despite the height difference, was All Might. Melissa grabbed the man's arm, gently pooching him next to Izuku. Now, she said, tell me what your problem is? Izuku took a breath. He'd planned for this. He could do it so long as All Me. I told him he couldn't be a hero and left him on a roof. Izuku had never before felt such a strong urge to facepalm. Or to slap the number one hero. Instead, he let out a laugh that he hoped sounded natural. All Might. What are you talking about? I don't remember that conversation. The man in question looked at him quizzically. Don't you remember? We got into an argument about a fight we were both watching, and then I said something about a similar fight with All Might, and you puffed up and said, I am All Might. The questioning look on his face didn't change, nor did it leave. Internally, Izuku groaned, waiting for the bulb to go off and for All Might to catch on. That's not what happened. This time Izuku gave into the urge to facepalm. This was the top hero in the country? Are you alright, my boy? Did the slime villain hurt your head? All Izuku did was groan into his palm. Remember? You latched onto my leg, we landed on a roof, and I accidentally revealed my skinny form. Then you asked if you could be a hero without a quirk. I said no, and I left you there. He groaned again louder. All Might continued to try to jog his memory, but was cut off by Melissa. You did what? All Might stopped and turned around. Looking back at Izuku's frustrated face, and then Melissa's furious one, he tried to backpedal. I mean yes, young Midoriya. Haha, I was only trying to play a joke on my niece. That was quite the argument we had about that hero, fighting, that one villain. He cringed back slightly at the look on Melissa's face, still furious. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Uncle Might, you're a shit liar. She turned to Izuku. Did he really say that to you? Izuku thought about lying, but the look on her face advised him against it. Slowly he nodded. Her fists clenched at her sides. So, when you told me I could be a hero, you were lying? She spit out. Do you really think that I can only become a hero with your quirk? That if you hadn't made your generous offer, that I would never make it? Is that what you're saying, uncle? She was taking small, steady steps towards the man. He spit out blood. Why, young Melissa, please? I chose you because you're worthy, not because you need it. Please, believe me. Your quirk? What does that mean? The sentence was meant to be a mumble directed solely at himself, but it came out louder than he expected. Immediately twin faces of utter panic turned to him. Fuck. Fuck 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 fuck, Melissa sang in her head. She was pacing back and forth, panicked, while her best friend lay unconscious at her feet. Her uncle was worse, frantically waving his arms and approaching the boy only to shy away moments later. I know it's bad that he heard that, but your first reaction can't be to knock him out. He rubbed his neck sheepishly, mouth opening and closing repeatedly. His face suddenly lighting up, he crouched next to Midoriya. Curious, Melissa leaned to get a closer look, only to see her uncle's hand repeatedly slapping him in the face. What are you doing? She shrieked. He didn't look up. This worked last time. What last time? This finally gave him pause, but he was cut off from answering when Midoriya finally opened his eyes. Both blondes froze completely, standing like deer in headlights. What? Clearly disoriented, Midoriya looked around, eyes unfocused. Finally, upon reaching Melissa, clarity returned. Melissa? He turned his head to the man next to him. All Might? What's going on? Why am I on the floor? And why does my neck hurt so much? He rolled his shoulders, groaning as he got up. The other two remained still, waiting with bated breath to see if he remembered. What are we doing here, anyway? You dragged me out here and... His eyes widened. And you karate-chopped me after Melissa said something about your quirk. Normally, I wouldn't have put too much thought into it, but... He turned back to Yagi, eyes sparkling. That's it, isn't it? That's your quirk? You can pass it on, somehow. Nedzu's been slowly easing me into the idea that it's possible, but I guess I just didn't really want to believe it. But it makes so much sense. The secrecy, the the fact that your school records have been erased, he ignored the man's squawk of indignation, meaning that either you had a completely different quirk beforehand that people couldn't know about or you didn't have one at all. And considering the fact that your quirk is as physically strong as it is, I'm willing to bet that it's that aspect in particular that gets passed down. Is it some sort of stockpile? That would make the most sense, seeing as there have been no other heroes in the past with any sort of strength even close to yours. It probably looked to most like you suddenly underwent a huge quirk evolution, so if I filter my searches to that I should be able to find past users. How is it passed on? DNA? That would be troubling, unless there were some sort of failsafe, like the requirement of your express consent to pass it on. Is strength the only thing that gets passed on? And wouldn't that strength be way too much to bear in an unquirked body? Unless the quirk itself helps accustom you to it, which is most likely necessary due to mental strain alone. Still, there must be some sort of minimal level to reach beforehand, because that level of power has never been seen in a quirk before, and yours is probably the closest to singularity out of any of the other ones out there thanks to not needing to wait out an entire growth cycle/generation before the next stage of the quirk. Suddenly he gasped. And that must be why you're training, Melissa. You must need a certain level of strength and/or just general muscle mass before you can use it, especially when you consider that All Might himself can only use it when he's buffed up. That late bloomer excuse works really well, now that I think about it. How long until you reach the necessary requirements, and have you taken into consideration how much stronger it's gotten thanks to All Might? And what number holder are you? If every hero with it has lived as long as All Might, then you can't be more than, like, the 6th. But with how strong it is, past users must have either not lived long or passed it on quickly, which begs the question, why? If there's one quirk like this, I guess it makes sense for there to be at least another one, and the holder might have something against this line of users. Of course, there's always the option that it's a natural death. As common as they are among civilians, few heroes have actually ever had simple strength augmentation quirks, which means that the past users probably had quirks before obtaining this one. If so, did their own quirk cause their early deaths? It seems likely. The strain of a single quirk inside of a quirkless body can be catastrophic, but adding one in where something is already taking its place? And with the level of power that it has? I wouldn't be surprised if literal cracks spread through their bodies, if it went on too long. He took a considering pause, fingers on his chin. But All Might's been active for a very long time. If that were true, he would have had to stop a long time ago. Sure, he's been reducing his patrol hours, but I know it's because of his injury. So that means, at long last, he stopped his unusually clear mutter storm. Eyes even wider, he turned back to All Might. He looked betrayed, Melissa thought, in the recesses of her mind that weren't still absolutely flabbergasted by the stream of scarily accurate analysis. All Might, his voice, so sure a second ago, was now timid, hesitant. Were you? He swallowed. Were you quirkless? Her head whipped around to look at her uncle, surprised that he'd admitted it. Sure, there wasn't much to be done now that Midoriya had guessed most of it, but still, shouldn't he be a bit more careful? Looking back at her friend, though, her breath stuttered. He looked heartbroken, the tears streaming down his face wiping off the remnants of sand from when he'd fallen. When he spoke again, his voice was choked up, as though a single word away from breaking into sobs. If you were, then why'd you? He took a moment to collect himself. If you were quirkless before, then why would you say I couldn't be a hero because of it? Why, if you knew what it was like? Yagi's smile was sad. My boy, I just wanted to protect you. Even at your age I was already strong and capable enough to fight many villains, but even that wasn't close to enough if they had a good quirk. I had no way of knowing that you had such a brilliant mind, and I'm glad Nedzu realized your potential before I did. He laid a hand on Midoriya's shoulder, which was very nearly flung off. At the time, I thought you just needed to hear someone tell you the truth. As difficult as it is, sometimes the most vile words are the most necessary, both to say and hear. Besides, he smiled, a bit closer to genuine. I may have a quirk now, technically, but I'm still quirkless. I understand your drive and your passion, so please, trust me when I say I only had your best intentions in mind. At some point, it had begun to rain, and heavy drops mixed with the sweat on Melissa's face and clothes. Midoriya's hair became matted, hanging low over his eyes. "No, you're not." All Might recoiled, a frown forming on his face. Even Melissa was surprised at the venom almost tangible in his voice. "Excuse me," he said, not unkindly. "I said you're not quirkless. Not anymore. Not when you don't understand." He spit the last word out, glaring at her uncle from under his hair. "Do you really think things are the same now as they were in the past? That all we get is condescension, or babying? Were you really so sick of being one of us that you haven't bothered to make a donation? Or do a quick search to find out how our suicide rates are at an all-time high, despite our population being at an all-time low? I've been told the so-called truth my whole damn life, yuck. You know what else I've been told?" Melissa had to remind herself to keep breathing. "It can't be that bad," she told herself. "It can't be that bad. I've been told to drop out, to leave space to people who will make something of themselves. I've been told to stop wasting oxygen, to watch out or I'll be just another statistic." He moved closer. "But those were all pretty tame. The day we met, I was told to take a swan dive off the roof and pray for a quirk in my next life. And guess what, Yagi? I was this." He drew a line in the sand, a few steps away from himself, and just in front of her uncle. Close to making his wish a reality. At his side, his fists shook, and he turned to walk away. "I suggest you do some investigation, All Might," he said without turning. "Things have changed. If you really still believe yourself to be quirkless, then act like it." As she watched the back of her friend slowly fade into the rain, a single thought ran through her mind. It was worse. Nedzu tensed as his student passed by his hiding spot, but luckily the rain and anger clouded his vision enough not to notice. He made a note to train him more in spatial awareness. Looking back at the remaining two, his tail drooped as he watched Melissa storm off without another word. No doubt she needed time to calm down and process everything she'd heard. After all, hearing your best friend admit they were nearly suicidal wasn't something to be taken lightly. It had shaken even him, and he'd had his suspicions for a while now. Shaking himself a bit to remove some of the moisture clinging to his fur, he walked over to Yagi. His tail dragged in the sand behind him, but he didn't care enough to lift it. "Yagi," he greeted. The man in question whipped around, a panicked look in his eyes. "Nedzu, I'm so sorry I messed up. Young Midoriya guessed about one for all, and he found out that I was quirkless, and now he and Melissa are mad at me and I don't know how to fix it. Nedzu silenced him with a flick of the tail to his knee, and he finally stopped to look down at him. He cleared his throat and climbed up a small pile of trash to get closer to eye level, something that was basically impossible considering Yagi's over 2-meter frame. "I know, Yagi. I followed Midoriya here to listen to the lie he came up with, and overheard everything." He ignored the man's surprised expression and sighed. He'd known, of course, that Yagi would likely take too long to actually go along with whatever lie Midoriya had come up with. What he did following that, when someone was so clearly not going to go along with what he had to say, was what Nedzu truly wished to evaluate, though he supposed the lie itself had been pretty good. What happened had been not great, to put things lightly, but a score wasn't Nedzu's focus at the moment. Right now, I'm sure Melissa is on her way to find Midoriya. Midoriya, I'm sure, is just realizing that he yelled at the #1 hero and therefore won't move until at the very least Melissa has caught up with him. They'll speak, and I'm sure their bond will come out of it stronger than ever. Both their relationships with you, however, he saw Yagi gulp. We need to figure out what we're going to do about that. I've got some ideas already, of course, but I'll need you for most of them. I'd also like it if you could give your input." Quickly ushering the man into a car he'd called a short while ago, they made their way to UA, the principal speaking, never letting up once. No input was given. By the time Izuku's actions caught up with him, he was most of the way home. Once he'd cleared the beach, he'd taken off, sprinting as fast as he could to just get away from everything. How could the man not understand? How could he stand there, speaking as though he knew? Who did he think he was? He was only All Might, the #1 hero in all of Japan. He came to an abrupt stop. He was the #1 hero in all of Japan. And Izuku had just yelled at him about not understanding struggle. If he'd had control of his body at the moment, he would have slapped himself in the face. Instead he stood there in stupefied shock, mind moving at a snail's pace, trying to comprehend the reasoning behind every life choice that led him to this moment. With every passing second he could feel himself dying inside, just a little. But at the same time, was he wrong? About anything he'd said? It was true that before All Might's time there were many more quirkless people, and due mainly to the increased criminal activity there were few who focused on belittling or discriminating full groups of people. The few that did were themselves criminal organizations, and only fairly minor ones at the time had quirkless people as their focus. So how could All Might know when the times had changed so much? When the same world he'd helped to create was partially responsible for the horrors people faced for lacking what many now viewed as a fundamental part of their being. At that same time, as such an influential figure, he was also responsible for keeping himself informed about everything that the people he was meant to protect were facing. As a base, he was already much better than some of the heroes out there, who would have watched and waited for him to suffocate before taking down the slime villain the moment they saw the bright red shoes on his feet. But shouldn't that be the absolute minimum for everyone? Why was it that having basic human decency was now heroic, in some cases? Loud, fast footsteps snapped him out of his contemplation. Spotting a vague outline that could only be Melissa, he considered sprinting off in the opposite direction. However, before he could, a hand reached out and clenched around his wrist so hard he was worried it would leave bruises. He turned to tell her to let go, but a single glance at her face shut him up. Even through the rain he could see clearly that she was bawling. Her face was red, lips wobbly, twin streams leaving the corners of her eyes and mixing with the water dripping down from her hair. He was about to start speaking, to ask her if she was all right, but she put a hand on his chest, and he once again stayed silent. After a short while she regained her breath enough to speak. "Izuku, you know that I'm here, right?" The confusion must have showed on his face, because she kept going. "You know that there are people that would miss you if you dash." She devolved back into uncontrollable sobs, and suddenly he understood. Gently, he took her hand off of his chest, holding it with his own. "Hey," he said softly. She looked back to him. "I'm not going anywhere." Sometime in the last few minutes he'd begun to cry as well, much stronger streams running down his face. He smiled through them. "You're stuck with me, Melissa." She hugged him tightly, a gesture he returned, and they stayed in the rain until they had both calmed down. By the time they arrived at Izuku's home they were so wet he had to lend Melissa clothes to stay warm. The rest of the night was spent watching old movies under blankets, eventually falling asleep in a way that caused Inko to fill her remaining phone storage in almost a single night. ******. Toshinori was pacing, every once in a while shooting a glance over to the crowd of people that regularly walked by the gates of UA. A few yellow heads of hair had passed by so far, but none accompanied by a shorter green one, and he was starting to worry they weren't going to show up. At least Melissa hadn't been angry enough at him to not tell him where she was staying the night before. Still, the message had been curt, only containing the bare minimum of information. He moved his hand to his mouth, before harshly nipping the impulse to bite his nails in the bud. Everything would be fine, he just needed a chance to explain. Yeah, he could do that. And even if things didn't go back to normal immediately, he knew he'd spend as long as it took to make it up to them. Especially Melissa. He remembered seeing her for the first time, in the hospital after her mother had given birth. He'd spent so long bouncing from partner to partner, never really forming a connection like the one everyone described, since he'd simply given up on the idea of a romantic partner, and by extension the thought of children. But the small, blonde baby's gummy smile had stolen his heart in moments. Some might think it was weird, having someone other than immediate family there for the birth of their daughter, but Toshinori had spent so much time around both of them that it was only natural at that point. And so, he was there for what he would later consider one of the most important events of his life. And when, a few hours later, complications arose, he was still there. He was there when the doctors rushed Rosemary into emergency surgery. He was there when David's excitement evaporated to be replaced with dread. He was there when she drew her last breath, clutching her daughter to her chest. And he was there when he vowed to Rosemary that he'd do his best to provide another positive parental figure for her daughter. It had become slightly difficult with such a demanding job on the line. Still, he'd made it work. He'd been there for every birthday, called every weekend, visited for the increasingly more impressive science projects whenever he could make it. But now, pacing outside the gates to UA, he couldn't help but think he'd failed. Sighing and shaking his head to dispel the thoughts, he once again glanced over the crowd of pedestrians. Already he'd gotten a few weird looks. It wasn't every day that one saw a gaunt, skeleton-looking man who towered over the majority of the population, he supposed. Luckily, however, it gave him the perfect vantage point from which to finally spot a head of blonde hair hovering just above the average height making its way towards the gate. He let out a sigh of relief when they both emerged, though the look of distrust on Melissa's face broke his heart. Hiding his hurt behind a smile he hoped looked genuine, he led them into the school. "I know there are things you both want to say. But please, can we talk somewhere more private? I have some things I need to say first." Begrudgingly, they both nodded, and soon they were making their way through the maze of hallways that led to Nedzu's office. A few times Midoriya had to correct their path, which had been a bit embarrassing, to say the least. He politely ignored the nearly silent remark about entering the school above ground, for once. Just what was Nedzu making this kid do? At long last they reached the office, which Nedzu had left empty for him after going over the points he should make once more. As it turned out, most of Nedzu's plans were just things he wanted to lecture Toshinori about. In the end, he'd just given him some pointers for what to say and how to say it. It was ultimately up to him to say what he needed to say, mainly due to the fact that Nedzu was in no way confident in Toshinori's ability to remember even a small set of bullet points, something he made sure to repeat several times. He'd grumbled about it under his breath, something the rodent no doubt caught, if his suddenly smug face was any indication. Young Midoriya looked nervous, all of the anger he'd displayed the day before seemingly evaporated completely. Melissa, on the other hand, was still scowling slightly, clearly hurt not only by his words the day before, but also the information of what he'd said to Midoriya. He really hoped he didn't fumble his words like he'd done the day before. With any luck, his years of experience with the press would come in handy now. The two love seats that normally occupied distant corners of Nedzu's office had been placed in front of each other in the center of the room. He gestured for them to sit down on one, and he took a deep breath before sitting down across from them. Before either of them could start, he cut in. "I know I said some things yesterday, and before that were insensitive and untrue, to say the least. And so I'd like to explain myself and apologize." He turned his gaze to Midoriya, who clearly wasn't expecting it if his jump was any indication. "What I said to you on that rooftop, I'm afraid it was the result of everything I'd internalized when I was young. You see, growing up I also wanted to be a hero. I had the same drive and determination I see in you today. But much like you, I was told at every turn that it would be impossible for someone like me. And so, when my mentor offered me a quirk, I guess I started to think that I would never have become a hero of any kind if it weren't for her offer. And when I saw you that day, all I could see was myself, unsure and kicked down by everyone. In my mind, the kindest thing I could do was help you come to terms with what had taken me so long. And so, I tried to encourage you into other paths, ones I thought were more achievable. Of course, my phrasing was absolutely horrible, and pretty much immediately I regretted the way I'd told you everything. Before I could return, however, I was caught up in another fight caused by my own incompetence as a hero." A few times throughout his small speech, Midoriya had looked like he was ready to argue, but he'd managed to keep going uninterrupted. Now, though, his eyes filled with recognition. A villain I'd trapped only 15 minutes prior had escaped, and was attacking a renowned hero. But I was out of time. All I could do was stand from the sidelines, watching as my employer was suffocated and the heroes on scene did nothing. But then I witnessed something incredible. Midoriya was on the edge of his seat now, no doubt questioning what it was that had caused him to finally step in. A small boy, with nothing more than his own wits and heroic nature, ran in and did more in under a minute than the rest of the pros had done since the beginning. The same boy I had just discouraged from heroics. If he could run out there, despite my earlier words and a lack of power, Then what was stopping me from doing the same? Midoriya's eyes were wide as saucers now, and even Melissa was perked up and paying close attention. Luckily, I managed to buff up in the last moment, taking down the villain and ending the destruction in one fell swoop. By the time I was done with the reporters, I had come to a decision, and I ran off to find you. My quirk was going to be yours for the taking, my boy, and I would have gone through with it if it weren't for Nedzu. Suddenly, it was clear to him that this was absolutely the wrong thing to say. Now they both looked angry again, and he immediately backtracked. And now, children, let me explain. They gave him unimpressed looks. Why, see, Nedzu had recognized your intellect. He knew immediately that you would make a great hero. He also knew why I was there, and that I saw so much of myself in you. This was the exact reason he told me not to go through with it. You see, Midoriya, you can accomplish what I could not. I know, and I knew then, that you were destined to become a hero. It's the same feeling I got with you, Melissa, from a very young age. But what I wanted, and what Nedzu made me realize I wanted, was another me. I wanted someone to become the next symbol of peace, someone who would follow in my exact footsteps. But I know you can be more than that. You're intelligent, young Midoriya, something I never had. You can and will be your own hero, but it wasn't fair to try and mold you into my own vision. And when I heard that, when Nedzu told me it would be best to find someone strong-willed enough to become their own hero even with my own power carving their path, you were the first person to come to mind, Melissa. You're incredibly astute, and if anyone can take my power and fully make it their own, it's you. I'm glad that both of you have found each other, and I truly am glad that you can both function as a support system for each other. One of my many regrets is that I didn't have enough people I could fully trust, and I'm glad you've found that in each other. I'm sorry for not being fully honest with both of you, but I swear I will do my best to prove to you that you can rely on me in the future. You both deserve that much, at least. He ended his speech in a low bow, not daring to look up in fear of the reactions he'd find when he did. After a few tense moments, he felt a hand on his shoulder, and was met with the teary face of Midoriya. It's okay, All Might. Really. I understand why you said what you said, and I'm sorry for what I said yesterday. I shouldn't have assumed everything I did about you, and I shouldn't have yelled at you either. I'm sorry. And, thanks for the apology. I don't think it was necessary, but I really do appreciate it. He smiled at him and received one in return. Next, he turned his head to Melissa, hoping she'd at the very least be on speaking terms with him again. She didn't look fully convinced, but she sighed. It's all right, Uncle Might. Although I think it'll take a little longer to, get over it. At the end of the day, you still thought that someone without a quirk couldn't be a hero. Still, I'm glad you thought of me first. And I appreciate the apology. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As much as he hated to admit it, the only reason Midoriya had forgiven him so quickly was probably his nearly non-existent self-esteem. Tears appeared in the corners of his eyes. Of course, Melissa, he replied. There's no one else I would have thought of. Are you sure you have everything? Notebook? Yes, Mom. I'm ready. His mom sighed as she tried to get her tears under control. Izuku leaned over to give her a quick hug. I promise I'll be fine. She sniffled. All right, Izuku. Call me when you're done. I'll make some katsudon to celebrate. Maybe Melissa and Yagi can come too? He smiled and nodded before practically sprinting down the stairs. Bye, Mom. Love you. Nervously waiting for the train to UA, he went over his studying material again. After nearly 10 months with Nedzu, he was sure he'd ace the written portion, but it was the practical he was really worried about. What would he have to do? He hoped it wasn't something like fight robots, but he was sure he'd be able to figure something out if it came to that. Maybe sparring? Or some sort of race? He shook his head. It was better to focus on what he did know for now. There was no use in worrying about things out of his control. He winced slightly at the memory of lying to his mom, but he didn't really have a choice. As far as she knew, this test was a regular admissions test, nothing to do with heroics. She still didn't know about his training with Nedzu, or that he'd even applied to UA. He was planning on telling her, really, but he sighed. He knew what her reaction would be, and he really didn't need her accidental words of discouragement right before the exam. He'd tell her after the exam, and then if he passed, he could prove that he was ready. If he didn't, well, Nedzu had plenty of backup plans. By the time he finally got off the train, his heart was beating so fast he was afraid it would leap out of his chest. UA's main building had never looked so imposing, and he found himself hesitating just before the barrier. Scary, huh? He jumped at the sudden voice appearing right next to his ear. Fumbling his notebook, he reached for it, failing to notice the loose brick at his feet. He was headed for the floor at what felt like Mach speeds, and he closed his eyes in preparation for the inevitable collision. A collision which never came. He cracked his eyes open, then opened them as wide as he could when he realized that a detached hand was the reason his fall had been broken. Yelping, he scrambled into a standing position, head whipping around to try and see where it had come from. Hey, sorry about that. I thought falling would be a bad omen, you know? Just outside the UA barrier was a girl with long green hair, her arm rubbing the back of her neck sheepishly. Just her arm, apparently. The hand at his feet suddenly buzzed by and snapped back onto the stump, and she started walking by him, gaze never leaving the ground. Wait, is that your quirk? She slowed, but didn't stop. Yeah. I know it's creepy, I'll try to avoid using it. That's so cool. Now she did stop, but he was too busy furiously scribbling in his notebook to notice. Can you detach any body part, or just your hands? How many can you detach at once? Is your telekinesis a secondary quirk, or part of the same? Can you still feel things with that hand? Is it based on lizards, and if so, can you regenerate lost body parts? He stopped himself before he could go for too long, but when he looked up it was clear she hadn't caught all his questions anyway. You think my quirk is cool? Now Izuku was just confused. I mean, yeah? Why wouldn't I? His confusion only seemed to make her happier. She gave him a blinding smile. No reason. I'd be happy to answer your questions later, but for now we should focus on the exam, yeah? He blushed, having forgotten about it. Pass me your phone. Without thinking, he did just that, wondering what she needed it for. Seconds later she handed it back. Now, when this exam is over you can give me a call. I love talking quirks. With that she rushed off, leaving a dumbfounded Izuku staring at a contact that read, Setsuna, dinosaur emoji. *******. It took him a little while to find the exam hall, but when he did he was slightly disappointed to not see Setsuna in it. He supposed it made sense, there were a lot of pro heroes after all, and UA was a really good school. Giving the room a quick glance, the only person he vaguely recognized was the youngest Todoroki kid. Shoyuda? Shoto? Something like that. At first he considered trying to make conversation, but he looked to be either not at all interested in conversation or somehow worse at social interaction than Izuku was, so that idea was scrapped. Spotting an empty seat in the back of the room, he hurried over to it so he could try to remind himself of a few more tidbits of information before the exam could start. Sure, he was confident, but a bit more studying couldn't hurt. Tense silence filled the room pretty much as soon as everyone was settled in. In a corner of the room, a clock he hadn't noticed before started to tick at what felt like an obscenely loud volume. Silently he vowed to hide Nedzu's favorite tea on a shelf he couldn't reach. Nerve-wracking, isn't it? A shy voice laughed beside him. Looking over, he saw a nervous-looking girl with long black hair in a distinctive ponytail. He cracked a small smile. It sure is. I'm going to have to finish quickly, because that noise is already driving me insane. She laughed for real this time, covering her mouth with her hand. I agree. I hope it doesn't ruin my concentration. The conversation immediately became an awkward silence, neither knowing how to continue. Suddenly, Izuku got an idea. Looking directly into the camera he knew was hidden in the upper corner of the room, he mouthed a few choice words, and immediately after the clock was retracted into the ceiling. He smiled, relieved, before noticing a few people drilling holes into his head with their eyes. What? He asked. Startled, most looked away save for Todoroki, whose gaze was now somehow even more intense, and the girl next to him. He tried to ignore the former, turning to the girl. How did you do that? She whispered, utterly confused. What did you say? Izuku scratched the back of his neck. I just told Nedzu I'd release one of his baby pictures if he didn't get rid of the clock immediately. I'm sure he's currently trying to hack into my computers to delete them. Not that he'd be able to. He had dozens of physical copies and several flash drives hidden around Mizudafu. He'd gotten them when Nedzu was teaching him to hack and had put them up as a reward, severely underestimating Izuku's skill level and determination. It had been completely worth it, to be honest. They were adorable, if you could ignore the fact that they were taken by scientists experimenting on him, and they served as perfect blackmail. Though he knew it was only a matter of time before Nedzu somehow got the ones his mother had taken. He was snapped out of his musings by the girl's furious follow-up questions, mainly things like, "Are you insane? How do you know Nedzu? And can I see his baby pictures?" He chuckled, but before he could answer, Ectoplasm walked through the doors holding a stack of papers. Todoroki only looked away from Izuku when his own test was placed in front of him. Izuku's test finally delivered. He tried to hide his hurt at Ectoplasm's treating him like he was radioactive before focusing completely on his page. As far as he could tell, it was the same as any other, but he couldn't count on that. Quickly flipping to the back, he sighed in resigned determination when he saw a sticky note with a cartoon drawing of Nedzu smiling. Flipping back to the front, he decided to leave it to the end. For his own sanity. Luckily, he breezed through the rest of the exam in no time at all, every question relating to things he'd already gone over in insane depth with Nedzu. With each answer marked, however, the pit in his stomach grew. If the test was this easy, he knew for sure Nedzu would have tried to balance it out a bit. He dreaded discovering what question Nedzu would actually consider challenging. Shivering slightly in place, he flipped to the second-to-last page, not slowing down in the slightest at the collection of calculus problems. Finally, he reached the dreaded sticky note. Tearing it off the page, his suspicion grew when he noticed that there was only a single question written. Squinting to see it better, his dread turned to excitement at the words on the page. Write an analysis on Ever-Pro Hero member of the UA staff. Include quirks, fighting styles, and weaknesses. Please ask Ectoplasm for the extra paper. Practically vibrating in place now, he raised his hand to get the teacher's attention. Hesitantly, he floated over, already holding a stack of paper and a few pencils. In the time it took Izuku to say "Thank you, Sensei," he'd already returned to his desk, pulling out what he hoped was a water bottle and taking a big swig from it. Ignoring the strange behavior, he got to work. Time flew by for him, though he was distantly aware of time warnings coming in from Ectoplasm at certain intervals. At some point a few people turned in their exams, and others broke down crying, but through it all he continued to write. It was on his 10th page dedicated to present Mike that he was finally interrupted. "Alright kid, hand it in." Ectoplasm sounded resigned, is the best word he could think of. Pouting slightly at being cut a bit short, he handed it over, packing his things up and walking to the door. Luckily, he'd planned for it, having started with a basic analysis for everyone before going back into more detail with the time he had. By the time he was done, only Lunch Rush was missing full detail. When he emerged from the classroom, he was surprised to see the black-haired girl standing to the side. When she spotted him, she smiled. "Great, you're done. Let's go to the practical portion." For a moment, he was stunned. "You waited for me?" She tilted her head quizzically. "Well, I'm still quite curious about the answers to my questions, after all, and I'd rather walk there with someone to talk to than do it on my own." With that, she turned to walk to the gym they'd be tested in, and he followed. "Still, you didn't have to. I appreciate it." She smiled. "It's no trouble. Though, I do have a question for you. It seemed you were working on a separate assignment for the majority of the testing time. May I ask what it was? And, did it have anything to do with your relationship with Nedzu?" He shuddered. "Unfortunately, Nedzu's been mentoring me for the past several months, and I'm sure he knew I wouldn't have much trouble with most of the exam, so he had me do analysis on the pro hero staff at UA. At least it was reasonable and kind of fun, to be honest." "What kind of analysis?" she asked. "Mainly quirks, but also a bit of fighting style and personality. The last one I still have a bit of trouble with, but Nedzu's working on fixing that." She chuckled, and they continued to walk for a bit in silence. "I never caught your name," she said eventually. "Oh, sorry, I'm Midoriya Izuku. And yours? I'm Yaoyorozu Momo. It is a pleasure to meet you, Midoriya. He smiled. You too. They stopped when they reached the building for the gym they'd be using, both of them hesitating at the last moment. I don't suppose you have those Nedzu baby pictures on you? He cracked a nervous smile. What, for your nerves? Unfortunately, no. But I'm sure you'll do great. You have nothing to worry about. She took a deep breath. You're right. She turned to him. Thank you, Midoriya. I do hope to see you in my class come August. With that, they entered, immediately being ushered to their respective groups. Funnily enough, it seemed that Izuku was alone with Todoroki, though for the moment he chose not to put too much thought into it. Surely the rest of their group just had yet to arrive. Surely Nedzu wouldn't continue to mess with him. Right? He was in a sort of observation room overlooking an enormous obstacle course that spread from one end of the gym to the other. He could see a small mountain, zip lines, and even a small lake. He shuddered, hoping his time learning parkour would be enough to get across in decent time. He really didn't want to have to take the general exam. One by one, he and Todoroki watched as groups ran through, though most seemed to put in little effort. At one point a guy with a wind quirk sped through, causing Izuku to launch into a muttering storm of theories for applications, and another guy who could apparently soften the ground ahead of him. Aside from that, though, nobody really caught his attention. No doubt they'd thought that being recommended was enough to get in automatically. When there were only a few groups left, he spotted a familiar head of green hair bouncing in place next to an equally familiar head of black hair. Sitting forward eagerly, he failed to notice Todoroki watching in interest. When they called for the race to start, he was amazed to see Setsuna split into several pieces, each one zooming to the finish line almost as quickly as the wind guy. However, she also took time to slow her opponents, sending her limbs off to push down the zipline handles and causing some of the less stable parts of the mountain to crumble. Overall, she was fast, and also all but made sure that nobody would be able to get even close to a normal time. At least, that's what he thought until he saw Yaoyorozu speeding through at full speed, barely giving the different obstacles a second thought. She dodged, ducked and weaved through at speeds he was sure he couldn't hope to match, blocking projectiles with, was that a shield? Looking closer, he noticed her pulling objects out of her skin to get past certain parts of the race. At the mountain section, she even created a grappling hook, shooting to the top almost effortlessly. Her quirk seemed to be the perfect counter to Setsuna's tricks, and he was happy that his, maybe, friend was doing so well. But what was her quirk? It was obviously something to do with her skin, seeing as she had so much of it exposed, and the objects seemed to be coming out of certain places on her body. Looking closer, he noticed a faint glow emerging from her skin along with whatever object she was making. Honestly, it reminded him of... His eyes widened. Her black hair could just be a coincidence, but the fact that she was recommended, plus the aspects he could so far see of her quirk, all led to a single conclusion. Was her mother Midnight? When he heard a gasp come from behind him, he realized he'd been muttering it all out loud. Crap. He turned to Todoroki, ready to backtrack, when he saw the expression on his face. It was one of barely concealed awe. You're right. Her quirk, her appearance, even the way she fights. She's Midnight's secret love child. Well, he wouldn't have put it that way, but he supposed that was what he was getting at. The sentence was delivered in almost full monotone, but it had an undertone of excitement. He continued. That must mean that she's married to the patriarch of the Yaoyorozu family. It's no wonder she's never made public. Appearances, she probably needed to keep the illusion of being single for her hero persona. Those were all good points, actually. Though he'd had no idea about Yaoyorozu's father, he didn't even know they were famous enough for Todoroki to know about them. This must tie into my theory that the Yaoyorozu group is a family of clones sent from the future. Izuku blue-screened. What? With all the technology they produce, they could only have come from a time when all of it is already well established. No doubt they wanted to create a fortune for themselves, so they sent back copies of their family. Todoroki completely ignored him, instead steamrolling ahead with the most bats-hit crazy string of sentences he'd ever heard in his life. But then one of them must have fallen in love with Midnight, creating a daughter that doesn't exist in the future because she was born in the past. Okay, now that just flat out makes no sense. Todoroki finally turned to him, head tilted quizzically. His expression, however, had become slightly more icy, the temperature in the room dropping. Why not? No, I mean your sentence. The syntaxes. What did you mean by that, exactly? The cold disappeared, and the boy continued talking in a voice about as excited as it could be, which still wasn't much. I mean that the majority of the Yaoyorosis exist both here and now, as clones, and in the future as the originals. But because she was born from a secret romance with Midnight, she's not a clone, and she has no future equivalent. But what if Midnight is also a clone? He couldn't believe he was going along with this. Then, their daughter could exist both now and in the future. Yes, but the chances of the child having the exact same genetic combination in two different scenarios is astronomically low. If anything, both children are different, distinct people, related but so far out of each other's time that they will never meet. The rest of the race is forgotten. They continued their debate, on one side animated and emotional, the other monotone yet still somehow passionate. In the background, race after race went by, each one ending anticlimactically enough that it never again called their attention. Still, even with some sort of dramatic finish, it was unlikely that anything could really pull them out of their increasingly ridiculous debates. Over an hour passed before they snapped out of it. And all I'm saying is that Wash could always just be a very short person. Just because nobody's seen them out of costume doesn't mean they're just an amorphous body inhabiting a washing machine. Todoroki's rebuttal was cut off by a sudden announcement calling the two of them down to the gym floor. Giving each other a quick last glance, they both walked out of the room to get to the race course. Realizing nobody else had ever joined him and Todoroki, he shivered, hoping he wouldn't have to race against him alone. His wish was soon granted, and he got the sudden intense urge to slap himself in the face. Violently. He cursed the rat as his squeaky voice filtered through the speakers in the gym. Still, he forced himself to pay attention, dread pooling in his gut with every passing second. Due to the uneven number of participants, we've been left with only 2 students in their final group. However, I think we're all tired of watching races. So, instead, Midoriya and Todoroki will be going against each other in head-to-head, one-on-one combat. Don't worry, winning isn't necessary to get into the course, just do your absolute best. Don't hold back. After letting out a few extra unhinged cackles for good measure, the speakers cut off and Izuku was left in stunned silence. Todoroki only turned to him with a completely straight face, and said, "Let's finish our debate in the ring." Which one? Izuku thought. His feet felt like they were made of lead as he made his way to the center of the gym, where Cementos had created a huge platform only moments prior. There had to be a reason Nedzu had done this, right? There was something he wanted him to accomplish. Thinking hard, he remembered the change in temperatures around Todoroki, and hoped his quirk wasn't overpowered. With his luck it would be. Seeing as how the boy in question looked like he wasn't at all planning on moving from his position at one end of the ring, he assumed the resulting attack would be ranged, so getting in close was a must. Tensing, he waited for the end of the countdown, shooting off the moment it reached 0. He didn't move a second too soon. The moment he rushed off, a large force pushed past him, making him stumble even farther away from his original position. Glancing back, his mouth dropped open at the sight of a massive glacier poking cracks in the goddamn ceiling. Eyes blown wide, he turned over to the culprit, who only gave a dry "You dodged" as a reply. Noticing the boy in question beginning to turn over to him, he shot up, sprinting towards the previous glacier. It was definitely risky, rushing to the previous attack. The chances of him being able to manipulate existing ice was high, but Izuku didn't have much of a choice anymore. He'd be forced off of the platform if he'd stayed where he was. Leaping from ice spike to ice spike, he silently thanked the fact that his shoes had such good grip. Twisting in midair, he observed carefully as Todoroki twisted his right foot, grunting slightly as he seemingly pushed the ice to gain momentum from his current position. It moved just slowly enough to be predictable, and instead of joining the previous ice it seemed to fight it, shooting fragments of ice as large as his head in every direction. Izuku rolled, keeping his face covered with his hands while he thought up a strategy. Getting up close was probably his best option, but if Todoroki grabbed him it was likely that he'd be frozen in seconds. His best chance was probably to keep dodging until he ran out of stamina for his quirk, though it was very likely that Izuku would feel the exhaustion first. He hoped that the sheer amount of ice being produced would deplete his opponent's energy first, because otherwise he was screwed. He ran forwards, sprinting just into Todoroki's right side peripheral vision. Hopefully a glance would get an instinctual reaction, getting him to shoot out another ice column from his left side. Instead of the expected reaction, however, the boy almost did a full 180, sending his right foot sweeping out to send something more akin to a wave of ice this time. But the new move wasn't what Izuku was focused on now. Why did he shift to move his right side over to him? Could he only use his quirk on the left side? That would be one hell of a weakness, one that could be easily exploited. But there had to be more to it than just that, right? In the split second before he'd committed to the spin, he'd hesitated, shooting his left hand out in what looked like an instinctual move. Drilled by training, maybe? But why drill it if his left side didn't have a quirk to call upon? All the while, Izuku never stopped zooming in and out of view. There was so much debris from the continuous bursts of power that the ground was covered in crushed ice, most of it looking almost like snow. Still, he didn't slip once, too used to running away from people and hands and explosions to make such an amateurish mistake. Sliding through a small gap now formed in one of the larger ice pillars with a hair's breadth of precision, he looked back at Todoroki. He was looking about as cold as Izuku felt, crystals of ice creeping up his arm and face, seeming to keep to his right side. Was his left resistant to it, then? Did his quirk somehow split into the cold resistance and the cold production? Not unheard of. Most quirks counted with some sort of mechanism to protect the body that wielded it, and with his ice as powerful as it was feasible to suspect that the power had ruptured it. But in that case, Todoroki's condition would be much worse than it was currently. That amount of ice could cause severe problems, starting with numbness at the very least. Still, his movements were just as smooth as before, so even his right side must have some sort of ice resistance. That meant that his left side was something else entirely. But what? His eyes widened and he stumbled on the ice as he made the connection. Todoroki. Endeavor. Fire. If half of Todoroki was such strong ice, then it stood to reason that his other side might not be as useful in a fight. Still, it would be worth using, regardless of what it was exactly. So why wasn't he? His eyes narrowed and he changed tactics suddenly, darting straight for a startled Todoroki at one end of the platform. The boy's eyes widened, and he stuck out an arm to defend himself from an attack, but it never came. Instead, Izuku stood directly in front of him, cold fury washing out of him in waves. "You're holding back," he said. For a minute, Todoroki looked stunned, and it took him a while to answer. So Izuku continued. "How dare you? I'm here, giving it my all, and you're restricting yourself to half your fucking quirk?" He seethed. "You think that when you're a hero you'll be able to afford to hold back? I can't comprehend why someone would handicap themselves like that, but you'd better get over it here and now. Because in the field, people will die." Todoroki's eyes hardened. "You don't understand. My left side is his. It's his quirk, and I refuse to use it. Besides," he glared even harder. "You preach going all out, but I have yet to see you make use of your own quirk. Because I don't have one, dipshit," he yelled. "You have no idea how lucky you are to have such a powerful quirk. And then you refuse to use a full fucking half of it because you think it belongs to someone else." He jabbed into the other boy's chest. "It's not anyone's but yours. It's a part of you. It can't belong to anybody else." He barely noticed the heterochromatic boy's eyes widen, instead taking a step back and getting into a fighting stance. "My whole life, people have underestimated me and treated me like shit. Please don't join them. Come on, Todoroki, let's make this a real fight." For a tense few moments, he thought it might not have worked. Todoroki stood unmoving, unblinking eyes staring straight into Izuku for what felt like an eternity, before a look he couldn't quite place crossed his face and his entire left side burst into flames. Izuku grinned. "Now we're talking," he said, rushing out to duck under a volley of flames, planting his hands onto the ground to kick both legs out in Todoroki's general direction. It connected, and he allowed himself a small smile before getting slammed backwards with another wave of ice. Hand snaking out to grab a nearby spike, he used it to spin himself back at him, aiming a fist for the side of his face that wasn't coated in slowly melting ice crystals. They continued, Izuku only being able to stand on equal ground thanks to the little training he'd gotten from Nedzu and Todoroki's own inexperience with using both sides of his quirk at once. They frequently got in each other's way, ice melting before he could send it out, flames extinguished before they met Izuku, all of which he pressed to his advantage. All of a sudden, however, he saw Todoroki freeze his own leg to the ground, crouching into a defensive position. "I'm sorry, Midoriya," he said, slightly less monotone. "And thank you." Realizing what he was about to do, Izuku flattened himself to the ground, body angled to keep the glacier behind him. His head was tilted upwards just barely enough to make out Todoroki's arms doing a large sweeping movement, meeting in the middle with their respective elements. The resulting explosion shook the entire gym, cutting the concrete around them into enormous chunks. Izuku felt himself skid backwards, arms and legs meeting the dirt and cutting holes into his clothes until his feet slammed into the thickest piece of ice left standing. Both his ankles snapped to the side, and he barely had time to hope that they were only sprained when the shaking stopped and he lifted his head to wait for the dust and smoke to dissipate. If he'd had any more energy to spare, he would have rolled out of the way, knowing that that would be the first place Todoroki would look to see if he'd won, but he was too exhausted to. Struggling to push himself onto one arm, he looked into the smoke, anticipating an attack that never came. Industrial fans kicked off, forcing the dust to leave the center of the gym, exposing for all to see the sight that Izuku was trying to come to terms with. Far out of the reach of the platform, an unconscious Todoroki lay among the concrete rubble of the ring. Izuku's last thought before being claimed by unconsciousness was that he'd won. Yaoyorozu didn't quite know what to make of Midoriya Izuku. Her initial image of him had been simple, just another examinee, probably one that wouldn't make it in with her. That wasn't her being arrogant. With so many hero hopefuls, the chances that the boy she'd sat next to would be one of the lucky four to get in this way was very low. Still, he was kind, if a bit shy. And then he'd threatened the most intelligent being in Japan, and fought Todoroki Shuto in unarmed combat, winning after forcing his opponent to go all out. All of those things were difficult to reconcile with the frail, almost sickly-looking boy lying in the bed before her. He'd been rushed along with Todoroki to Recovery Girl, but she'd had to let them sleep off some exhaustion before treating the burns on both of them. Momo wouldn't lie, she was worried they'd scar. It was strange, though. She couldn't remember the fire reaching his shoulders, nor could she figure out how it would create starburst-like patterns. Todoroki wasn't doing much better. He lay in an identical bed next to Midoriya, but his was elevated, one of his legs tightly wrapped to keep the bones in place until Recovery Girl could use her quirk. Momo shuddered. They'd both really gone all out, hadn't they? It put her own performance to shame. A girl with green hair leaned over her shoulder, snapping a few pictures at Midoriya before snickering slightly at the image. "What are you doing?" she asked her, voice a bit sharp. It was an invasion of privacy, and she hoped that the girl was at least good friends with him. "I'm taking pictures to commemorate the occasion." "Are you kidding me? This is gold. I'm going to have so much fun teasing him in class." Many questions sprung up at that statement, but Momo latched onto the last part. "In class? How do you know you'll both get in?" The girls rolled her eyes as though the answer was obvious. "Girl, I got the second fastest score in class, and you showed extremely impressive quirk control in addition to coming in fifth. If we don't get in through recommendations, we'll get in through the traditional pass. These two, on the other hand," she gestured at the two prone boys, "are pretty much guaranteed." That was an impressive display of skill on both their parts, and I'm sure Nedzu will add points for going plus ultra. She stopped for a second, hand on her chin. "But still, don't you think that was a bit weird? Nedzu never changes the exam like that, especially not in the middle of one. Why not add the two of them into other groups? Or have a larger amount of slightly smaller groups? There must have been a specific reason for pitting them against each other." "It's because he's a bastard and he has it out for me." Both girls jumped a bit at the new voice, still rough from waking up. Groaning, Midoriya sat up, wincing as his bandages cut into his many cuts, burns and bruises. I knew that becoming his personal student was a trap of some sort. I just thought it'd take him less time to land me in a hospital. Leaning on an arm, he turned, legs spilling over the side of the bed to reveal 2 wrapped ankles. He planted them on the floor and groaned again, doing his best to stand with the wall as support. Both Momo and the other girl stood there, stunned, just watching as Midoriya grit his teeth through what must have been a very large amount of pain. "What are you doing? What are you doing, you idiot?" Frantic footsteps carried into the room, a cane coming up to whack Midoriya in the chest, effectively knocking him back into bed. "Do you have any idea how injured you are? I still need to heal you." Midoriya's eyes turned to her, taking a bit to focus. When they did, they widened. "Recovery girl. It's great to meet you. Can I have your autograph? You can call me Chio, and I'd rather meet you outside of my damn office. Besides, where would I even sign dash?" She was cut off by a notebook being waved in her face, a small black pen in a bandaged hand next to it. She stared. "Where did you get that? You're in a hospital gown." Seeing he wasn't going to answer, she sighed and put her name down next to what she now realized was a very detailed sketch of her. Coughing into her hand to disguise her smile, she kept going. "Were you trying to walk out of here? You have second-degree burns over your whole torso, not to mention 2 nearly broken ankles and too many cuts and bruises to count." His notebook now mysteriously gone, he looked down in interest at his bandages before saying, "I've walked off worse." He blinked. "Forget I said that." It was Todoroki, surprisingly, who spoke up next. "Me too. Does that mean I can leave?" Both he and Midoriya shriveled back into their beds at the glare Chio sent them. Grumbling about stupid teenage boys, she walked over to each, planting a quick kiss on each cheek. Without further ado, she turned back to the reception part of her office, leaving the 4 teens alone. "Hey, Yaoyorozu? Setsuna?" Both girls looked over to Midoriya, the former filing the latter's name away for later use. "Thanks for coming to check on us. How long were we out?" "Not too long, Greenie. And don't worry, it was nothing." Momo nodded her agreement, a feeling in her gut telling her that he would have done the same for her. "It wasn't nothing to me." Setsuna and Momo both started, not expecting the sincerity on his face, before the former broke out into a huge smile. "I'm sure you'd do the same for us, Greenie." Desperate to hide her blush, Momo looked around for something to focus on instead, eventually landing on watching the injuries on Todoroki starting to fade. One by one, Momo watched in fascination as the small bursts of red slowly left his skin, small cuts zipping together in a fascinating display. Todoroki seemed to grimace a bit at something from his leg, but otherwise looked to be completely healed, before she glanced back to Midoriya. The other girl took the words out of Momo's mouth before she could say them. Midoriya? Looks like you might need a second round of healing." She was pointing at the ring of starbursts on his shoulders and, presumably, continuing to his back. Following their gaze, he tensed before relaxing when he spotted what they were talking about. "Oh, don't worry about those. Recovery Girl's quirk only takes care of injuries up to around a few months old, so there's nothing she can do about these. Besides, if it did, I don't think I'd have the energy." He chuckled, failing to notice the mood in the room plummet. "Midoriya?" Todoroki started. "What are your parents' quirks?" The boy brightened. "My mom can attract small object to herself. It's basically minor telekinesis, but without much versatility. And my dad had fire breath." Momo tensed even more, though it was nothing compared to the absolutely murderous look on Setsuna's face. Finally noticing, Midoriya waved his hands in front of his face, panicked. "Wait guys, no. It's not like that." His face fell as he trailed off. Much more quietly, he said he was a great dad. Noting the was and the tiny tears popping up on the corners of his eyes, she decided to drop it. Todoroki, however, did not. "Where did those scars come from, then?" "It's fine, Midoriya, you don't need to lie for him around me. We can form a club for it." Wait a minute." He narrowed his eyes at Todoroki. "What did you just say?" Todoroki just looked extremely puzzled. "About what, the club?" "I'm sorry, I thought that clubs were something friends did together. I apologize for prematurely considering you my friend." No. It's not that, Todoroki, of course we're friends, he replied as though it were obvious. To Momo, who had just witnessed them both trying to kill each other a couple of hours ago, it was not. I was talking about what you implied. He continued more softly. Does your father hurt you? Is he the reason you didn't want to use your full quirk? Todoroki's eyes widened, and he looked away. It's not like any of you can do anything about it, anyway. He's the number 2 hero. And it's not like it's more than just some rough training. I'll be fine until I turn 18. If she thought Setsuna's face before had been murderous, she was wrong. It had nothing on Midoriya's now. Next to him, Setsuna matched him, but all Momo felt was sick. How many times had she seen him with his father at social gatherings, and had no idea? How long had it been going on? She should have done something to help. Yaoyorozu? The voice was hesitant, but it snapped her out of her spiral regardless. Todoroki swallowed, as though unsure why everyone was reacting like this. You couldn't have known. It's fine. And Midoriya, he turned to him. I don't know what you're planning, but there isn't much you can do. It's no use. That's where you're wrong. His voice was like steel, cutting through any reservations she might have still felt. Without looking away from Todoroki, he continued. Nedzu, you caught that on camera, right? A small chime was heard overhead. Good. Todoroki, it might take me a while, since I'm currently busy taking down my middle school. But I promise you that as soon as I'm done Endeavor's going down, by the time you graduate, he'll be nothing but a footnote in the story of your success. Everyone was silent for a moment, until Setsuna spoke up tentatively. You taking down your middle school? All of a sudden Midoriya's fierceness evaporated, leaving him picking at his bandages nervously. You did ask where I got my scars, right? Immediately the somber atmosphere returned, stronger than ever. Momo was horrified. What kind of school would allow that to happen? She supposed that the fact that he was in the process of tearing it down was answer enough. Damn, the trauma in this room is through the roof, huh? Setsuna tried to joke, but it didn't do much to lighten the atmosphere. Momo gave it another try. She cleared her throat. So, Midoriya, what's it like being Nedzu's personal student? Nedzu's what? Momo chuckled slightly at the sudden barrage of questions from both other occupants of the room. Smile disappearing, she silently vowed to look into both Endeavor and the public schooling system. Such things couldn't continue, not under her family's watch. ********. Setsuna cackled at the face Yamamoto was making. It had already been about an hour since Shudo and Greenie had been released from Recovery Girl's clutches, and instead of heading home immediately they decided to have a look around campus before separating. The conversation hadn't slowed since, especially with tales from Greenie's lessons with Nedzu, which were fucking wild, and now the retelling of their match. More specifically, the conversation they'd had before it. I think I'd know if my family were a group of time travelers. I've seen the development labs. Todoro. Shudo, he interrupted. Right, sorry Shudo. I'm just not quite used to it. He nodded his head in acknowledgement, and she continued. After telling them about his father, Greenie had asked, and now they all were calling him by his first name instead of his family's. At first he hadn't seemed to care, but soon after he was correcting everybody on it immediately, so they all went along with it. Anyway, like I was saying, I've seen the development labs, and I know for certain the technologies are thought of, developed, and produced there and then. Shudo only tsket in response. She still hasn't denied anything about Midnight being her mother, though, Greenie muttered to himself. Realizing his mistake, he looked up, eyes blown wide in panic, but it was too late. Shudo turned back to Yamamoto. That's true, Yaoyorozu. Is there a reason? Setsuna was ready to laugh it off, chalking it up to another crazy conspiracy theory with no base, but Yamamoto just tried to sputter out a response before turning away, face red. Holy crap, it's true, she said. No way. There was no way that one of Shudo's conspiracy theories had paid off. She may not have known him long, but every theory to come out of that boy's mouth was completely ridiculous. So how? Midoriya, it seems your hypothesis was correct. His face still lacked much expression, but they could all tell he was excited. Please teach me your ways. So it wasn't a Shudo original. That made sense, she supposed. But how had Greenie guessed? I'm sorry, Yayarozu, I didn't mean to pry or anything, it was just an observation about your quirk and hair, and then Todd Shudo overheard, and it spiraled into, well, I'm sure you can guess, but I swear I didn't mean to breach your privacy. It's fine, Midoriya. We were expecting it to get out eventually, just not quite so soon, I guess. She chuckled. You sure are perceptive. I can see why Nedzu would choose to mentor you. Still, can you all keep it a bit under wraps for now? I'll already be known as the rich girl, I'd rather not add Midnight's daughter to it. They all nodded, Setsuna still trying to figure out how the hell Greenie had figured it out just from watching her in the race. She was interrupted by a phone ringing, which soon emerged from Greenie's pockets. He walked away slightly to answer it. She sighed. Looks like we have to leave soon. It's gotten pretty late, huh? In the distance the sun was already almost touching the horizon, painting the color in an array of yellows and oranges. It was great meeting you all. I'll be sure to make a group chat for us as soon as I get home, so we can keep in touch until we get our results. I hope we're all in the same class. Shudo just hummed, and Yamamo gave her a bright smile. Greenie walked back to their group. Hey guys, I have to leave. I'll see you around? Definitely, dude. Us green beans have to stick together, alright? She chuckled. I can't wait to go to school with you guys. It's gonna be so much fun. A car honked outside, and Yamamo started, getting up to head to the gates. I agree. This has been nice, I look forward to training with you all. Setsuna waved her off, waiting for the other two to walk to the station. Greenie was off to one side, Shudo having pulled him aside moments before. She managed to make out the question, where do you put your notebooks? Before she tuned them out, giving them their privacy. Eventually they separated, and he headed over to her, sans Shudo. Where's Shudo going? Doesn't he have to catch a train too? He shrugged, confused. Yeah, I'm not sure. He said something about clearing something up with faculty, and that we didn't need to wait for him. His gaze moved over to Shudo's retreating form. I didn't question him, but now I'm curious. Setsuna shrugged, grabbing his hand and leading him out of the gate. We can always ask him later. Come on, we have to make the train. They kept up steady conversation on their way to the station, mostly about the extent of her quirk, which had been really fun to talk about. It was nice, meeting someone who wasn't creeped out by it. Distantly, she noted that Shudo and Yamamo seemed like the kind of people who wouldn't mind either. She smiled. Today had been a good day. They made it back just in time for her to catch her train, her body finally catching up to all of her exhaustion the moment she sat down. Smiling, she created the group chat, unable to wait until she was home. She couldn't wait to tell Kurasudo. ********. Izuku groaned as he sat down across from Nedzu, gratefully accepting the tea placed in front of him. The rodent only snickered. Did we really have to have a lesson today? He said, pained. This morning I could barely stand, much less get to the station. It took me so long. Once again the rodent only chuckled. Hopefully this serves as extra motivation to not take unnecessary risks. Landing yourself in the hospital is not acceptable, Midoriya. I hope this experience helped you realize this. Nedzu's tail flicked rapidly near the floor, an impulse Izuku had learned was entirely involuntary, and his eyes widened. Generally that indicated worry, or anxiety, and it was in perfect contradiction with the sly grin he was wearing. Had Nedzu been worried about him? Of course, I understand to a certain degree why you did it. Still, I expect you to be more careful in the future. Izuku just nodded sheepishly, still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that his mentor had worried about him. He'd shown worry before, sure, but this felt different, somehow. A good different. I'm glad you managed to break through to Todoroki, and I agree that Endeavor would be an interesting project for you to take on soon. I think you'll be a good influence not only on him, but on Yaoyorozu and Tokige as well. Of course, the reverse is also true. I think you'll benefit from some friends besides young Melissa. Izuku only sighed. It's too bad I won't be able to be in a class with all of them. That is, if they all got in. That's actually something I wanted to talk to you about, Midoriya. Nedzu sounded serious, and Izuku sobered up. The HPSC wasn't too happy with one of the 4 recommended admissions year. I'm sure you can guess why. Izuku gritted his teeth, and he saw Nedzu's whiskers twitching the way they tended to do whenever he thought about the HBC. So they won't let you enroll me because I'm quirkless? The rodent smiled and put down his tea. On the contrary, Midoriya, I've made it abundantly clear that you are to join Class 1A this coming school year. They have, however, changed the conditions to the recommendation admittances because of this. Izuku leaned forwards, deciding to freak out about officially being in UA later. They agreed on the condition that you would count as just a normal student. That is, I'm to enroll 4 recommendation students aside from you. Izuku sat back, relieved. A small part of him had worried about taking someone else's spot, but now he knew he had nothing to worry about. In fact, this meant there was a much better chance of sharing a class with his new friends. But that's not all I wanted to talk to you about. No doubt you've been wondering about Setsuna, Todoroki, and Yaoyorozu, correct? He nodded, wondering what he was getting at. Well, I can tell you for certain that Setsuna and Yaoyorozu got in. As for Todoroki, I think it's best if I show you. Typing quickly at his computer, he tilted the screen after a few moments to show a camera feed of Nedzu's office, empty save for himself and a familiar head of red and white hair. What? Todoroki. What brings you to my office? Screen Nedzu said. He produced a cup of tea from thin air to hand him. I understand you have final say on any and all admissions? Nedzu chuckled. Straight to the point, I see. Yes, I am fully in charge in most cases, but not all. What is it you would like to ask? Wait, why only most cases? Izuku asked, confused. Nedzu only pointed at him. I had to bring in a few other people to ensure that I wasn't biased in your case. His whiskers twitched in amusement. They argued against many of the tactics I used against you. It was most amusing. Izuku ignored the frankly hilarious mental image that thought provoked and instead focused on the video once again. Todoroki hesitated. Do you need to go through my father first? I believe that whatever the issue is can be solved between the two of us, yes? Todoroki sighed, relieved. Perfect. Go ahead, ask what you wanted to ask. Again, Todoroki hesitated. I would like to drop out of the recommendation exam admission process. Izuku's jaw dropped. Why would he drop out? Did he not want to go to UA anymore? Was it because of something Izuku did? Midoriya, please just keep watching. Your questions will be answered, all you need is a bit of patience. Izuku forced himself to relax, and Nedzu chuckled. He unpaused the camera feed. Nedzu leaned back in his seat, barely surprised. Would you like to elaborate on your reasoning? He nodded. I realized today, thanks to Midoriya, that I've been holding myself back. If I truly want to become a hero in spite of my father, then the best way to do so would be to go all out, to do my very best to become the hero he never was. Not to mention, getting in through recommendations is a little hypocritical of me when earlier today I was handicapping myself to do everything without what I perceived as his. He paused, as though debating whether or not to say anything else. Besides, I lost my match with Midoriya. I shouldn't take someone else's rightfully earned place when I didn't do anything to qualify besides showing off a flashy quirk. So, can I expect to see you in a few weeks for the general entrance exam? Todoroki nodded. Great. If you want, I can hold on to your exam, so you don't have to take another one. After all, the general one is much easier, so... The video cut off as Nedzu paused it. Something must have shown on Izuku's face, because the rodent laughed. There you have it, Midoriya. You needn't worry about any of your friends. All 4 recommendation students have been selected, and I can tell you that Setsuna and Yaoyorozu are 2 of them. Izuku felt like he was ready to cry. The first 3 friends he'd made since meeting Melissa, and they were all going to go to school with him. His eyes widened at another realization. Wait, so that means we might all be in the same class? I knew you'd catch that. Yes, Midoriya, you may all end up in the same class. And I'll consider pulling some strings to do it on purpose if you finish taking down Aldera by the time school starts. Izuku gasped and then smiled. He could do that. Admittedly, progress had been slow for a while. Between studying for the exam and training with Melissa and Yagi on the beach, he'd found little time to focus on his hellhole of a middle school. Luckily, however, he had all the evidence he needed perfectly compiled, He had contacts in news stations, hero schools, and even a few on the police force. Of course, none of them knew his real name or age, but he'd worked on getting a favorable reputation through occasional analyses online. Most of his contacts knew by now that he was conducting an investigation into discrimination in various schooling districts, and with any luck his stunt with Aldra would serve as a warning sign for any others nearby. Though, from what he'd seen so far, it wouldn't really be necessary. Apparently Aldra was a bit of an outlier. Luckily for him, Aldra wasn't big in the public eye, so while exposing them all at once would be shocking, there wouldn't be any people denying or defending it. With Endeavor, however, the process would have to be much slower, with small seeds of doubt being thrown in throughout a semi-long period of time. Izuku couldn't wait to destroy the man's reputation, but he needed to be careful about the public's reaction. The rest of their class that day was spent discussing which new outlets to tell first, what footage to release, and who on the police force to tell. Nedzu pointed out that Izuku had to tell his mom about everything first, though she couldn't find out about it all through the news. And that meant telling her about Nedzu. And you went, "If you'd like, Midoriya, I can accompany you. After all, it's only fitting that she meet her child's mentor at some point. I can help you break the news, and possibly smooth over the reaction." He sighed. "That would be appreciated, Nedzu." "Thank you." He nodded. "All right, let me know when to come over. In the meantime, it's getting late, so you should head home. Warrants take longer than an article, so you can begin to send evidence to your contacts in law enforcement. I'll see you soon, Midoriya." Still sore, Izuku groaned slightly as he got up, but sitting down for so long had given them a chance to rest. Almost at the door he turned his head. "Thanks for everything, Nedzu." The rodent only smiled, an ear twitching. He thought, "I haven't seen that before." Bye. He was not looking forward to what the next few days would bring. "And so then I had to fight him. I had to fight Todoroki goddamn Shudo. In unarmed combat. Like you would have done any better in armed combat?" Izuku spluttered, and Melissa giggled at her friend's antics. They were in her room, having decided to go to her place after the usual beach cleaning. Well, usual for Melissa, at least. She hadn't seen Izuku in a few days, and she was prying every bit of information out of him about what he'd been through. To be completely honest, all the stories did was increase the already significant amount of fear she felt for Nedzu. She shuddered just thinking about the exam she'd have to take in under a month, now. Would he treat her the way he'd treated Izuku, just for being All Might's successor? She hoped not. She sat in rapt attention while her best friend recounted his meeting with Nedzu the following day, and the discovery of Todoroki's decision to take the general exams. A small amount of dread pooled in her gut. From what she'd heard about the boy, she'd be extremely lucky to take her practical test separately from him. She was in no way confident she could beat someone that powerful with a quirk she'd gotten less than a week beforehand. Belatedly, she realized that Izuku had stopped talking, instead just laying on the floor in tense silence. She remembered something about a last conversation with Nedzu before he trailed off. Did something happen? She was about to ask him about it when he kept speaking, voice coming through as a low murmur instead of the previous excited rambling. She leaned forward to catch it. "I have to tell my mom about everything I've been doing." Melissa let out a breath, relieved. "Is that all?" "That's not too bad, Izuku. I'm sure she'll be proud of you. I mean, you're already super smart, and you're becoming even smarter, not to mention stronger. You can take care of yourself, and I'm sure she'll see that with time." Izuku stayed quiet, and she worried she'd said something wrong. She looked over it all in her head. As far as she could tell, she hadn't, so why? "It's not only about that. It's about Aldra too." Melissa furrowed her brows, before gasping. "You mean, all of it? But why now, specifically?" "I'm almost ready to take down Aldra as a whole," he replied, in the same tired monotone. "But when I do, it'll be all over the news. Even my name, maybe. I can't let her find out like that. I can't. But I also don't want to tell her." His voice cracked. "How am I supposed to tell her?" Melissa jumped down from her bed, scooching over to sit next to Izuku. "Hey," she began softly. "You're one of the strongest people I know. If anyone can, it's you. And if you want, I can be right there when you do." He looked up at her, tears in his eyes, and smiled. Thanks, Melissa, but that's not necessary. He sniffed. I'm lucky to have you. Melissa only smiled in return. They stayed there for a good while, Melissa's hand having somehow found its way into Izuku's hair at some point, until Yagi called them to dinner. Just in time, Izuku chuckled, wiping the tears from his eyes. I'm starving. He moved to get up, and paused when he felt his wrist tug backwards. He looked back at her. I was serious, Izuku. She looked him in the eyes, silently begging for him to believe her. If you need me there, just say the word. I know you'd do the same for me. He swallowed. I know, Melissa. Thanks, but I need to do this on my own. He gave her a watery smile. I've kept so many secrets from her. He choked on his words. She deserves to know. And she deserves to hear it from me, and me alone. With that, he walked out, tears having dried just enough to not be called out by Yagi. Melissa sighed. They still needed to work on his ability to ask for help, but she was proud of how far he'd come. She just hoped Inko took the news well. The next day came all too quickly for Izuku. Between training with Melissa, classes with Nedzu, and dinner with All Might, he just barely managed to distract himself from what came next. Hell, he just managed to relax enough to get some sleep, as little and fitful as it had been. And now, with morning rays of light peeking through the curtains, it all came crashing back down. He groaned, heaving himself up. If there was one thing he'd learned from Nedzu, it was how to get shit done, and knowing that leaving something for later only ever made things worse. Unless the purpose was to create tension and allow the paranoia in your enemy's opponent's minds grow. But that was getting off topic. Izuku took a deep breath, doing his best to follow the exercises Nedzu had taught him for calming a racing heart. This definitely wasn't going to be pleasant, but at the very least he wanted to be able to get through the bulk of it before he broke down. His mother deserved that much, at least. Quickly, he wrenched open the door to his room, marching out to the kitchen. His mom was already cooking breakfast, humming to herself contentedly as she stirred something in a pan. His mouth watered, but he sat down, clearing his throat of an unwelcome lump that he hadn't noticed. His voice cracked when he said, "Mom?" She turned, having noticed something in his voice if her expression was anything to go by. "Izuku? Are you okay? Do you need to stay home from school today? Oh, is it the nerves from the exam you took? I'm sure you'll do fine, baby, you're so smart. Mom," he repeated. "We need to talk." "Oh, of course, Izuku, honey." Gingerly, she turned the heat off under the pan and moved it off the burner, sitting down across from him. "Now, what is it? Are you feeling unwell? You don't have to go to school today, if you don't want to. In fact, I can call into work and we can spend a day together, if you'd like. It's been a while since we've done that, hasn't it?" It was funny, Izuku thought idly, how similar the two of them were. Although for him, rambling wasn't restricted to being nervous. He gave her a small smile, hoping to reassure her slightly before he broke her heart. "Yeah, I don't think I'm going to school today. Or the next day, actually. Or the day after that." He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the confused expression on his mother's face. "Mom, I haven't been completely honest with you. About a lot of things, really. I want to tell you the truth now." His mom's expression shifted, becoming slightly more serious, more focused on what he had to say. And yet she didn't move to speak anything in return. Izuku swallowed. "I haven't really been seeing a friend, on those times I tell you I'm going out." He cringed. "Well, I guess he is a friend now, but not in the way you think. He's not exactly my age and dash." "Izuku." His mom had shot up, hands gripping the table. "What did he do to you?" Her eyes held a fury he'd rarely been a witness to, and he subconsciously moved back, moving his shoulders to cover his neck and hunching his back slightly. This didn't go unnoticed, and she immediately relaxed, though the fury in her eyes did not diminish in the slightest. Izuku got his breathing under control, and he continued. "No, Mum, it's not like that. He's been teaching me." He closed his eyes. "He's been teaching me how to be a hero." He cringed backwards, waiting for a scolding, for yelling, for the assurance that he wasn't going to be a hero no matter what he did. He loved his mom, but he knew how she felt about him and heroics. Or he thought he did, at least. I know, Izuku. Her voice was quiet, quieter than he'd heard in a while, and he dared himself to open his eyes. If that's all you wanted to tell me, then I'm glad you came clean about it, but I've known for a while. I've seen you come home sore so often I started to think you were getting into other activities with Melissa. Izuku's face became beet red, and he barely had time to eep out an indignant mom before she continued. But then I looked up Yagi Toshinori and, well, he's All Might's secretary and a certified personal trainer. Of course you went with him. I'm slightly upset you didn't tell me right away, sure, but I always knew, sweetie. This is nothing to worry yourself over. He sat, silent, waiting for the confusion to go away before scrounging up the courage to continue. No, Mom, it's not Yagi. I barely even met him a few months after I started training with Melissa. I've been training with Nedzu. Again, he tensed, waiting for the surprise that was sure to come. His mom just sat there, mouth agape, eyes wide. Eventually she forced out a small what, which was enough to prompt him to continue. Well, I saved him from a villain attack when the other heroes on the scene did nothing. I ran off after he defended me from them, but he tracked me down later to return one of my hero analysis notebooks. He was impressed, I guess? And so he invited me to UA to take some classes. He thinks I can be a hero like him, Mom. A hero who doesn't get too close to the actual fights, but helps anyway. And honestly, it's been really fun so far. She remained silent, eyes searching his face. For what, he didn't know, but he hoped she found it. Where were you really last Friday? He flinched. I was at UA taking the recommendation exam. Did you get in? Izuku's eyes widened, and he looked up to her, not having expected the question. Slowly he nodded. A choked sob forced its way out of her mouth. Izuku, I'm so proud of you. In moments she had stood up, walking to the other side of the table to wrap him in a hug. Izuku could feel tears already dripping down onto his hair, and his own eyes squeezed shut in a half-hearted attempt to keep himself dry a little longer. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Izuku felt his mom unwrap herself from him. She sniffled a few times, floating over some tissues to wipe her eyes, and passed a few over to him before she sat back down. I understand you were nervous about it, Izuku, but if you already knew you got in, then why aren't you excited? His smile was watery and unstable as he picked himself up, urging himself to continue. Mom, that wasn't the only thing I needed to tell you about. He took a deep breath. As you know, Nedzu is one of the most perceptive beings on the planet. Within a single class he'd figured out several things about myself, and about Aldra. Through me. His mom was looking at him with intense curiosity, and he wrenched his eyes away. He recognized signs of abuse. He swallowed but didn't give his mom time to respond, instead barreling through. And so he decided it would be helpful for me to try and take it down myself. He's been with me through every step, and now I have the evidence needed to get the whole faculty arrested. Practically enough to warrant the building itself being burned down. But I can't do that without releasing it all to the public, and, well, you didn't want me finding out about it through the news. He kept his gaze turned away, afraid of seeing the expression on her face. Yeah. The two of them stayed there for a good while, neither making a move to speak. Eventually Izuku just couldn't take it anymore. He stood abruptly. I'm going to my room. Izuku, wait. He hadn't noticed his mom get up, but now she stood in front of him, a hand on the sleeve of his shirt. Tears streamed down her face. I am so sorry, baby boy. There was a lump in his throat, but he forced the words out anyway. Mom, really, it's not your fault. I did my best to keep it hidden, you couldn't have known dash. I'm your mother, Izuku, she yelled. More quietly, she continued. I'm your mother, and I didn't notice. More importantly, you didn't feel like you could come to me with it. I've failed you, Izuku, and I'm so sorry. The strength seemed to leave her along with her words, and she sank to the ground, the fall slowed by Izuku following her. Their arms didn't leave each other, both holding on like it was their lifeline. No, Mom, you're great. You are, and I trust you, it's just... He chewed his lip, debating for just a moment before continuing. I didn't tell you because a lot of it was kaken. And I know how important your friendship with Auntie Mitsuki is, And I also didn't want to ruin his chances of being a hero, so I just kept quiet. But it's fine now. The school is going down, and it can't hurt anyone anymore. He chuckled slightly. Actually, Nedzu also wanted to reveal that I'm his apprentice during the takedown, if I agree to it. Shady school districts will fear me the way corrupt institutions fear you, Mom. She sniffled, scooting closer to him on the floor. Like mother like son, I suppose. She gave him a wobbly attempt at a smile, and he returned it, albeit a bit more steadily. They stayed until their breathing calmed down and the tracks of tears on their faces dried, and when Inko's nose cleared enough to smell the food she'd been cooking. Goodness, I'm glad I took it off the flames before our talk, Izuku, she exclaimed as she hustled over, and he gave a light-hearted chuckle. It felt good to have it all out in the open, he thought. And now he could actually say goodbye to the place and people that had as good as tortured him for a decade. He moved to the table, clearing off the many-used tissues and setting the table for the two of them. He was so engrossed he almost missed when his mom spoke again. Hisashi would be proud of you, Izuku. His eyes darted over to the picture by the door, of a laughing, tall, freckled man with black hair. On his shoulders sat an enthusiastic Izuku, no older than 4. Izuku gave a small smile, just barely enough to push the tears budding in the corners of his eyes down to his face, and looked away. Wow, Melissa, you sure work quickly. Melissa allowed herself a proud smile, looking over the huge expanse she'd cleared herself, for the most part at least. Izuku had been a great help. Still, the vast majority had been all her, especially the larger appliances and even a few cars. As strong as Izuku had gotten through his training, he was still nowhere near what Melissa had achieved under Toshi's watchful eye. Thanks, Uncle Might. She looked over at him, a sly smile on her face. Does this mean I can finally sleep in tomorrow? He chuckled good-naturedly, and they stood in the sinking rays of the sunset, admiring the golden glow that the now clean sand seemed to emit. Toshi was the one to break the silence. You're ready now, my girl. Her head whipped around to stare at him. You mean? He laughed. Yes, Melissa. You're strong enough to take my quirk now. Although I think it best to wait until tomorrow, we wouldn't want a quirk activation incident in the middle of the night, now would we? She tackled him in a hug, not expecting him to actually fall, the momentum taking them both onto the ground. Sand sprayed up around them, filling the air along with the sound of their startled laughter, and they separated, nearly identical pairs of blue eyes staring off into the sky. Melissa heaved a contented sigh. Thank you, Uncle. For everything. She didn't look over, but she could still practically see the corners of his eyes crinkling from his usual smile. Of course, Melissa, he said. Anything for you.